call the meeting to order at 7 o'clock. We'd like to inform all board member attendees that this meeting is being live streamed and archived for access at any time by our community members on the internet within 24 to 48 hours of the meeting's conclusion. And please rise for the pledge. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call.
Mrs. Farber.
Here.
Mrs. Junk.
Here.
Mr. Carey. Here. Mr. Lawler. Mrs. Pavlak.
Here.
Mr. Rivas.
Here.
Mrs. Witt.
Here. All right, with 7 members present, we have a quorum. Would anyone like to move something from consent to new business? All right, seeing none, we'll go to the approval of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve the agenda? So moved. In a second?
Second.
And a roll call.
Mrs. Junk.
Aye.
Mr. Carey.
Aye.
Mr. Lawler.
Aye.
Mrs. Pavlak.
Aye.
Mr. Rivas.
Aye.
Mrs. Farber.
Aye.
Mrs. Witt.
Aye. Motion carries 7-0. We'll move on to the superintendent salutes.
We don't have any for tonight, but just a reminder, in April, when we come back from break, we do have, the first meeting, we'll have our Illinois State Scholars will be here, and as well as our athletics and activities from middle school and high school. They'll be recognized here in April.
Great.
So nothing for tonight.
All right, so move on to public comment. Are there any public comments tonight? Nope. See none, we'll move to the consent agenda. The consent agenda consists of the following action items: the approval of the Treasurer's Report, February 2020, approval of parameters for accounts payable and payroll, March 2020, approval of minutes of the February 24th, 2020 regular meeting, approval of resignations, terminations, and employment of staff, approval of amended school calendar for 2020-21, approval of Illinois High School Association membership for 2020-21, approval of Fox Valley Career Center joint agreement, approval of annual Board of Education purchase of student artwork, approval of destruction of audio recordings from closed session meetings from August 2018, approval of storage use agreement with Mid-Valley Special Education Cooperative, and the following informational items: the student suspension data report, the Freedom of Information Act request report. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
In a second? Second. And a roll call.
Mr. Carey.
Aye.
Mr. Lawler.
Aye.
Mrs. Pavlak.
Aye.
Mr. Rivas.
Aye.
Mrs. Farber.
Aye.
Mrs. Witt.
Aye.
Mrs. Junk.
Aye. Motion carries 7-0. We'll move on to new business, approval of minimum staffing plan.
Yep, I see Dr. Adkins is getting ready to share the information, but as he's moving up there, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Adkins, Linda Ross, and the administrative team, staff. It's a number of meetings and planning and organizing through course selection, through course enrollments, all of the work to get to tonight, or to get to tonight. So thank you, and make sure you share that on behalf of myself and the board, our appreciation for all the work.
Thank you. Appreciate that. As you know, tonight we're here to present our minimum staffing plan. A couple of reminders. You'll be hearing projections tonight. Please remember that projections can and do change typically based on enrollment, based on registration, special education needs. You'll kind of hear that disclaimer a couple of times this evening. Also, just a reminder, we do this in March due to the state school code requiring that we notify teachers of changes to their job status within a certain time frame to the end of the year, working backwards. So that happens in March in every school district. We often get asked, why can't we do this later towards the year when projections are a little more solid, we know a little bit more information, and that's because the school code requires that we do it now during this time frame. So that's why we're here tonight to present this information. As you've seen in the past, our presentation follows a similar format. There's a couple of guidelines that we utilize when we're planning for the coming year. We do have language in our contract with suggested class sizes for elementary and then middle and high school. You see those up here. K2 at that 21, 22 range, 3-5 at the 22 to 24 range. We have some suggestions for everyday kindergarten, and then middle school and high school at 26 to 1. We do have a couple of kind of capstone considerations for you to be thinking about tonight. Overall, our FTE for next year will increase by about 2.4 FTE. Okay, so overall, and we'll get more into detail about how those people are being utilized and where that comes from, but know that we're looking at a slight increase for next year's FTE. As we make our decisions this spring, if we get changes to enrollment or any of those other things that we mentioned, we'll bring that to the board for conversation with you. And then we do have some parameters that we have to follow in terms of special education. And I know that we've discussed that with the board before, that sometimes we don't have an option to not add staff if we get to certain numbers. Some additional considerations or data points for you to know this year. I try to share with you the longitudinal look at our FTE. Our FTE did decline from 17-18 to 18-19, but then is rising again in response to enrollment and sectioning. Enrollment doesn't, sectioning and FTEs don't occur in pockets because enrollment doesn't occur in pockets. So we might look at elementary increasing by 20 students, but that doesn't equate to a teacher because it might be 2 students at this grade in this building and 3 students in that grade at that building, et cetera. Some of our numbers, Fox Valley, due to the member districts notifying our district of what, in Fox Valley, of what's going on. Early childhood, kindergarten, some of those things are still pending because school is a big time. Kindergartners are registering. Early childhood students are having their staffings for next year. So some of that information is still coming. In regards to special education, we want to make sure you're aware of the trends that at the elementary level, we see an increase of 19 students with IEPs. Middle school is decreasing by 1 student, and the high school is increasing by 20 students, excuse me. And that's the difference between those kids graduating and leaving or being dismissed from services and those that are. We kind of just keep track of the sum total of that over time. Early childhood through 5th grade is down by 26 students for the coming year. Remember though, that doesn't necessarily equate to a teacher, but that's an overall enrollment drop. The middle school will see a decrease of 58 students. If you recall, we've talked a lot about where that bubble is of our students and the number of students we have. That bubble is in the 7th and 8th grade. Okay, 7th grade has 352 kids, 8th grade has 381 kids, and after that we see some drop off down to about 300, and then the 280 to 300 is a pretty flat at the elementary level. So that's stabilized, but then we have that bubble that's going to now move through the middle school and high school just like it has through the elementary school. Middle school is going down by 58 kids, high school is going up by 57 kids. So if we look at our enrollment projections, this is just a capstone of all that information. On here is also our outplaced students. I know that's something that we've shared with the board in the past. So we have 4,227 kids projected for next year. There's an additional 73 kids that we're responsible for but go to other sites other than somewhere here in Kaneland. And that's an overall drop from last year. All right. Elementary class sizes, we've shared this. We've talked a lot about class size averages with the board. Please remember that this is one view of class size, and this is maybe not the most comprehensive view depending on what context or what lens you're looking at class sizes through. And it may be different than what you see from the state, but this is our students divided by our FTE to give us these class size averages over time. So you can see by building and then by year where we're at, and we're leveling off at around 22 kids per class. This chart represents what's happening at the elementary school. Elementary school is what we would call flat. There's no additional increase in FTE for the elementary school. What we are seeing are we're going to see some shifts based on, we had 3 sections in 1st grade at one school, for instance, and that 3 sections at 1st grade, there were 4 sections in kindergarten, so that section moves up. That person may or may not move up with the kids or whatever, but overall it's a flat staffing pattern. And I know we're going to need to move an everyday kindergarten, all-day kindergarten section from one building to another, but overall the total number of sections isn't changing. So we're looking at a flat staffing pattern for our elementary school. Again, that makes sense with the enrollment stabilizing. Okay. Middle school is where we do see one reduction and one shift. So I'd like to talk you through that real quick. Right now we're showing that 2 FTE less at the sixth grade. As we continue to schedule, it may not actually be 2 teachers from the sixth grade because of how we do teaming. We will most likely need a 5-person team at each grade level due to the math classes that we offer. So it may be that we have a 5-person, a 4, and a 4 at one grade, and then again at 7th grade or something like that. And Mr. Faulkner is working with his team to finalize that, but we know overall we will have 2 less core instructional teachers at the middle school. You'll see down there for instructional coach, you'll see +1 with an asterisk. That's not an increase to staffing, that's a shift from the high school. Currently, the high school has 3 instructional coaches, and the middle school's only ever had 1. And with the number of students at the middle school, we'll be shifting one of the instructional coaches from the high school to the middle school. So it's not an increase in staffing, but it'll be a reassignment to the middle level from the high school. Okay? Our projections for the high school, this is where it gets a little bit trickier because overall you'll see a 3.4 FTE increase, but that's going to be dropped overall by shifting and the reduction at the middle school. Okay, so from a district perspective, we're only up a certain number of FTE, but for this site, for this level, all in, we're actually up 3.4 FTE. And you can see a breakdown of where we've gone down in sections and where we've gone up in sections based on all of the little parts and pieces of what we do when we register kids. So again, this is probably a prime example of where the raw number of students doesn't equate to a direct number of FTE because we may have to have 2 or 3 more classes of this subject or that subject. And so Mrs. Maris with her team, as they're going through all of that, you can see where we've increased and decreased in a couple of different places. Driver's ed, for example, is our big one. We're going up by 1.45 in that. On our next slide, I'll show you where we were accounting for all these different increases and decreases. So overall, 3.4 at the high school. This shares that district-wide perspective with you so that you can see how we get to the 2.4 number, okay? You can see the middle school with those 2 core class reductions, an ELA and a math, and again, that may not exactly be in 6th grade, but because that 6th grade class is what's lower, that's what we put in there, just so that we can kind of see that that's tied to that enrollment piece. You can see the driver's ed is up by 1.45 FTE, but 4/4500ths of that comes from reassigning current staff. So as we go down in this and up in that, if someone's certified, then they can go and do this other section and stay full-time, basically, but cover those other needs. So at the end of the day, we're only going to need 1 FTE for driver's ed, even though we have 1.45 additional FTE need for driver's ed, because we'll be able to cover that 0.45 internally. And so that covered by existing column shows you that even though we're up in math, we have some other things that went down and people certified who can then cover that math section. So net for the district, there's no increase for that. You can see all the way down, we've got included in there the 3 special education teachers for the elementary for co-teaching that are offset by other financial components we'll talk about in April when we come back with the paraprofessional and support staff components for staffing. So that's a net 0 for the district. But those are increases in the number of bodies, but budgetarily and allotment-wise, it's a neutral. And then we do have the district personalized learning coordinator in there that we've talked about along the way, as you've heard from our Ed Services Department about what we need moving forward for personalized learning. So all of the covered by existings and everything else equates to 1.4. Add in the district personalized learning coordinator, we're at 2.4. I'll pause real quick for any questions about that, because now we'll kind of get bigger again and talk overall district, but if there's any specific questions about elementary, middle, or high school. Yeah.
On the numbers going up in the high school, is that, I know there's a group going up.
Correct.
Is that considering those number of people to go to, or students, if you will, that go to the private schools?
The 8th grade to 9th grade shift, that does not count them in yet, because that's a hard count of kids that we have in 8th grade now. but we do know historically that we do lose some to private sections. Again, though, those students that move out, I don't know if there's any one group of students big enough that go to a private setting in any one courses enough to impact our staffing for any given department or class section.
And on average, how many students typically?
I'd have to look at my colleagues.
25 to 30.
Yeah,
That's
Yeah.
the number I had in my head.
yeah. So,
When you do the math to figure out average class sizes, like I noticed on one of the slides you have instructional coaches listed as part of the staff. So when you do the division, that
doesn't include
it's
them.
strictly teachers in the classroom divided by
Yep.
students? So, okay.
Yeah. But what gets averaged out, which could be misleading, is this is the total number of teachers at that building divided by the number of students, or the number of students divided by the number of teachers. So you could have a class of 25 and a class of 20, and then it averages to 22 and a half. So you get that piece is kind of hidden a little bit. So you might hear in a given year of a high class group in one building at one grade, but that wouldn't necessarily be represented here because you're dividing all those core classroom teachers by all the kids.
Okay.
Or all the kids by the teachers. Okay, so overall staffing. You can see here, 336.67, 2.4 gives us 338.07. The support staff, please know that that number includes all of our non-certified groups. So IT, not just paraprofessionals. And then we have not gotten to that part of the staffing process yet. That comes in April. We have the personalized learning coordinator counted in here for a total of 518.24. So that's our 2.4 increase. So budget-wise, FTE-wise, overall, we're up 2.4, even though there's down at the middle school, a little bit more up at the high school. This just gives you another view of that 2.4, what they are going to be. We have an additional special education teacher at the high school. We have the personalized learning coordinator, and we have miscellaneous high school sectioning. So that's where we've got that split out, and we wanted to make sure that you had an estimated dollar amount to go with that FTE allotment, so that you can see that here. This is just a narrative of what we just talked about so that you can have that if you wanted some talking points. Please know that last one I think is important. We kind of use that as a disclaimer every year. We are going to begin shortly monitoring enrollments weekly. And if we have any concerns, we'll bring those forward to the board. Please know we're watching first grade at Stewart and second grade at Blackberry Creek. Those are getting to be high numbers. But not high enough for an FTE at this point in time, but we're watching it. We just wanted you to know that we're watching it. Okay. And then we wanted to talk a little bit real quick. What we bring to the board is a minimum staffing plan. It is just what we need to run next year at its base. However, there's always things that we want to consider. I'd like to thank our ad team for beginning conversations about this all the way back in November. What is it that our students need? What is it that our staff needs? What can we do to best provide for the students here in Kaneland? And as happens every year, there's an extensive list of ideas, supports needed, suggestions, programmatic changes, but they have not yet until this year made it to the board to just know about. These are following things that we're going to share are not things we're asking for at this time, but they are things that we felt the board needed to know about and have on your radar to consider so that if you did hear these things from us in the future, you kind of know that this isn't a snap judgment or request, but that these are things that are truly needs in our district that we're considering as we go along. In no particular order, social workers. We're in need of additional social workers to support the social and emotional needs of our kids. When and where and how many, I think Kaneland Connects will guide us a lot in that. I think our students will guide us a lot in that, but at this point in time, we know that need is out there. We've talked a lot about it, what and where and how. We're not quite sure yet, but it's not part of our request for next year. But please know that that's out there. A network manager for our IT department. As we continue to move down that one-to-one path, the tech needs in the district are increasing. And our current staff are going to be reaching a place where they're not able to manage some of the network functionality of our district. And so we're going to need some backbone for that and potentially need to talk with the board about that. Additional secretarial support for the Buildings and Grounds Department. We've been talking about that as a potential need. Behavior specialists to support our social and emotional needs. And those would be different potentially than a social worker in that they'd be more embedded in the classroom, in the Tier 1 setting potentially. School counselors, again, to support our students. Some secretarial support for the athletic department. Maintenance employees to support our infrastructure. Secretarial support for the Ed Services Department. Behavior transition assistance to support our kids going into mainstream classes, some of those outplay students or some of our self-contained students as they come back in. And then full-time assistant principals at the elementary schools. So these are all things that we've talked about over the last couple months that we felt the board should at least have on your radar and know that we're thinking about. And if and when the time comes for us to talk with you further about that, we wanted to at least plant the seed. So just some things to consider. And not only do we, questions? Go to questions. No, go ahead.
Jump the gun. So with the Kaneland Connect strategic plan, is the timing of its completion such that the staff, because, I mean, to accomplish some of the things, I think, you know, there could be and likely will be additional staffing needed. Is it timed so that that happens not before the next staffing, like not before next March? Or is it possible that we may see that prior to then?
Yeah, okay, great question. I think the personalized learning coordinator for next year is a piece of that we are bringing that is part of Kaneland Connects and part of Kaneland 2020 moving forward. So that is that one piece. But if there are other ones, we will bring those and then also consider those changes for next year too. So it could be, that's why.
A little bit of both.
That's why Chris shares it's the minimum staffing plan. So it could be next year or it could be for the following year. So we'll continue to monitor that as we finish.
Okay, so the time, it's not
No,
intentionally timed so that it happens at the next staffing plan or anything?
no.
Okay.
It was when that plan ended and tonight's our night because of a number of reasons. And so
Yeah.
if there are other things, we'll bring them.
Okay.
For sure. Thank you.
Dr. Atkins, I think it would be useful, and I'm sure you're already thinking this, but like to start prioritizing these maybe, so we start like putting them in what's going to happen, what ones do we need next kind of thing. So I'm sure you're doing something like that. So.
Sure.
Start
That's absolutely part of the conversation.
Sure, sure.
Assume they're not prioritized right now.
In no particular order.
I thought so.
I think we've had some preliminary conversations, and depending on who you are and what you're responsible for, you, of course, have priorities. But as far as a district activity to say this is what we're doing, we have not gotten there yet, but in the works.
Maybe it's just assumed, but it seems a little strange that more teachers aren't on that list.
I think some of these positions would technically be teachers, social workers, counselors, behavior specialists. Those would all be teachers. Behavior transition assistants would be paraprofessionals. So not necessarily core classroom teachers, but I think when we talk with our teachers, they're asking for that related services support for those needs that are beyond the scope of their abilities in the classroom. The social emotional piece is a significant component.
No, I get that. I'm just surprised that more teachers, so smaller ratios, isn't on that list.
Or I guess I was taking that a different lens of like some of the personalized learning pathways in the high school, if those certifications don't exist in the current staff. I guess maybe that nets out, but if there are specialties that you're hoping to gain at some point, I could see that as well.
And it's part of the, back to Teresa's question, part of the timing as we move forward, that's part of what the personalized learning coordinator is going to look at and see what classes and the timeline and what it might, actually the timeline is part of what that person is going to do, and then we can report back with maybe some of those positions in the future.
Correct.
So for years, I felt that the student services department at the high school is just really, you know, they've been spread pretty thin and they need extra people. And it appears that the strategic plan, you know, is gonna put a lot more on that. And I would really like us, you know, when we talk about college planning and even just planning, you know, for post-high school in any way, especially as it gets more personalized, there need to be a lot more counselors so that the kids can meet with a one-on-one
Right.
more often.
Right. We're taking a little nibble at that with our social workers. If you look at this one, because the high school piece is relatively complicated, you'll see that we have an increase in our social worker by 0.5. So we are increasing some of that student services department this year. And I think as we get more down the pathway with personalized learning, that you'll hear all these various things come up, for sure. Other questions? No?
Anything else?
Thank you. Thank you for your ongoing support.
So I'll entertain a motion that the Board of Education approve the minimum staffing plan for certified staff for 2020-21 as presented.
So,
In a second?
second.
And roll call.
Mr. Lawler.
Aye.
Mrs. Pavlik.
Aye.
Mr. Rivas. Mrs. Farber.
Aye.
Mrs. Witt.
Aye.
Mrs. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Carey.
Aye.
Motion carries 7-0. We'll go on to J2, approval of stipends and differentials.
Yep, I'd like to introduce Dr. Adkins. He will come up and he will share the second half of the presentation.
Thank you. So stipends and differentials also comes before the board this time of year. And different this year from prior years. Please know we had new contract language with the KEA that changed how this process occurred in the past. The decisions about what was run and what was not run was done through conversation in a joint committee with the KEA. That is now different. It's different in that administratively it's decided what is run, what is not run, and then we work with a joint committee with the KEA to set the rate for that work. So that just allows us to maybe look at it a little bit more from a different lens than we did in the past. And what you'll see from that work comes here tonight. What we did this year is we met with all of the administrative representatives from all the levels to find out what might be needed elementary all the way through high school. We solicited proposals, as we've always done, from the membership themselves. Are there any clubs out there? Are there any things people want to run? We looked at all of those pieces. We had individual conversations with the two staff members that presented proposals. And then Jill and David and I got together, Mr. Rollman and Mrs. Maris and I got together and looked at all of those things. And then Jill was able to work out a plan with Mr. Rollman to come forward tonight. Once we had that plan, we shared it with the KEA so that they could look at what we were suggesting and to set the rate accordingly. And as we looked at that information, just like we do every year, we have an athletic audit, an activities audit. Who's interested in what, who's currently doing what do the kids pay for, what do they not pay for, and what might they be interested in continuing. All of that information was looked at. I think as you've seen in prior years, the various ratios and things for our sports were all within expected norms from IHSA and various groups, coaches groups and those kinds of things. We had a variety of activities looked at. We want to make sure, as we do every year, that underrepresented groups are able to have opportunities. We wanted to make sure that we didn't have any redundant programming or redundant activities. I just described that process. As we look at this, due to some of our participation rates, the recommendation you're going to see here does remove the Model UN club from our roles, but it does add head girls golf, head boys tennis, and head boys bowling as coaches because we have enough kids and enough interest to run those programs.
Define enough.
Right. So we have 32 boys that are playing tennis, that will be playing tennis. We have 12 to 15, because we kind of factor in that we might lose a child or two, for boys bowling, and 6 to 8 for girls golf, depending on who returns next year. So we've got, so those sports typically smaller sports. They're not a football team with, 40, 50 kids on it, but those are sufficient numbers for those 3 activities, those 3 athletics.
6 to 8 kids is defined as sufficient?
For golf, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're looking at adding those three athletics. The rate for head sports of this type, according to the contract, would be lane C, and the starting rate for that is $48.91. So when we add up those 3, take out the Model UN, that would be an increase to our budget of $13,292. These are 3 sports that are in our conference. In other words, we have teams to play. Kids will be able to get all the conference athletic awards and academics athletic awards and all those different things. They'll be able to compete for titles and those kinds of things as well. Not all of the things that we're considering and we have in front of us are sports that the rest of the teams in our conference, districts in our conference offer. So that was a factor in some of our thinking. But just like the minimum staffing plan, we also wanted to share with you the things that are on the radar for the high school. And again, in kind of no particular order, we have a couple of things that are out there that kids are doing right now that may need to come before the board in the future. Lacrosse, middle school wrestling, high school girls wrestling, winter percussion, soccer for boys, and girls track. So the numbers are trending in a direction that we might need to add some of those programs in the future. So you may hear that more about that from Mr. Roman and Mrs. Maris in the coming years.
Don't we already have soccer for boys?
We already have soccer and we already have track, but we have enough numbers that we might need assistance for those.
We don't have lacrosse.
We have lacrosse, but it's kind of a hybrid program right now.
Okay.
The other big piece at the moment is there are no other teams in our conference to play against. We have teams to play, but they're all out of conference, so it doesn't come with that IHSA component. And we're traveling to North Shore, essentially, to have teams to play.
But we're under the IHSA umbrella, right?
They are under the umbrella, correct. They're just not in our conference. But we have enough kids that might be something that you'll hear from us in the next year or two. We're trying to look at all of these things over a couple of years and phase in what we can when we can, with the goal of getting to be able to serve all of these needs.
Now, the 3 that you're adding,
Yes.
typically you kind of double with whether the boys or the girls, and then eventually, I guess, separation time has come, if you will. How long have these other teams been going hand in hand, like the girls golf?
I don't know that. I'd have to get back to that and have Dr. Lady update you on a Friday update.
Same thing with tennis, boys?
I know that they've been embedded with the existing team. So like last year, our girls at the high school played and practiced and did things concurrently with the boys team, but Mr. Meyer can't split himself into 2 to be in 2 places at once. So, but I can get you those, how long that's been happening.
I think one item to note on that question is activities and athletics can run slightly different, whereas with athletics, you really can't have a team participating in an official IHSA capacity until it's approved, whereas activities, if there's an activity, you can have some students coming after school, play chess or work for a yearbook or do some of those things that aren't official stipends, and then they work towards that so they can say, for 3 years we've had X amount of numbers. Like with girls golf, there's been a single golfer with the boys 2 years ago, like 3 or 4 girls golfers this year. So you can build towards it, but some of the sports, like boys tennis, it wasn't an official team. It's either not a team and you have enough students and you make it into a team, which is different than activities where kids can come after school and they can participate and play, and then you show that you have numbers over a period of time. So the important thing to note with these, as we would with other sports as they come on, is to monitor these numbers to make sure they're balanced and successful moving forward, and I kind of balance it that way.
Okay. It makes sense, because I know, at least in the past, and I don't know what the criteria is presently, there was usually like you gotta go for a couple years
Yes.
and then eventually bring it up and
And that's easier to do with activities and athletics, yes.
Hi.
So going back to your slide for budget impact, that doesn't include refs and buses and all that other stuff. This is just stipends.
This
So
is
we're,
just the stipend part of it.
so your $13,000 number could be
3 times that much.
double. I don't know.
I don't know the offstage pieces that are involved. I don't know that bowling, tennis, and golf have referees. I know that the coaches are there. I don't believe that they have a lot of those ancillary costs. I do know that there's some cost. I mean, I'm sure maintaining the tennis courts costs money, but we're doing that already with the girls' side of that. Bowling and golf, I'm sure there's buses and traveling to events and things, but I don't know if we have a good number to ballpark that. I didn't come with that tonight, but we can get that for you.
You said 32 kids for boys tennis. Is that how many were participating, or is that survey number, or where did that number come
I
from?
believe that's the survey number.
So you have 32 people that expressed interest in playing tennis.
Mhm.
How many kids do you have playing lacrosse?
I would have to go back and pull that data for you. I have it, I just don't have it handy.
I guess I'm struggling with adding things that people expressed interest with versus clubs that are already participating and have the kids showing up. And why one's on the list and one's not.
I do believe that the survey gets the number of kids who are interested. I also believe there's a number of kids currently playing. I can get you that number too.
Have the students already signed up for next year?
Do you know off the top of your head? For tennis, how many kids are playing tennis currently? Okay. Right.
Have the students already signed up for next year, or is it just the courses that they sign up for?
They just sign up for the school, are you talking?
There's
Just
a
courses at
signing
this time.
period,
Yeah,
right?
just
Retention,
courses, yeah,
right? It's
yeah, yeah.
Just courses,
Yeah.
not, so they don't show the interest at that point?
Not
if they wanna
yet. No,
play
they wouldn't do
tennis?
that till prior to that season beginning.
And if we didn't, and we do have contract language that if we don't get enough kids, we have a certain deadline by which we could not pay the program to run, just like we did years ago with 7th and 8th grade football. If you recall, we lost all those students and didn't have enough kids to field a team, so we were able to cancel that. So were that to occur, we'd be able to do that.
What's that enough number again?
For which
Well, let's say
sport?
you want to,
I'd have to
boys
rely
bowling,
on,
they-
I'd have to ask Mr. Rollman what that cutoff is. I don't have the specific, how much per athletics, per
What-
sport.
all right, let me rephrase the question. So you want me to approve a boys head bowling coach
Mhm.
based on a survey of people that expressed interest, and then you're telling me that if not enough kids actually show up, you're gonna cancel it, but we don't know how many enough is.
We do. I personally don't, not being the athletic director. I'd have to ask the athletic director what that number is, but I can get that for you if you like.
Right, that seems like information I'd like to know before I vote on whether or not to approve positions.
Okay?
Same with lacrosse.
I mean, it seems like from what Dr. Atkins said, lacrosse does have some complicating factors if they're all non-conference. Like, that does change the,
I guess I don't understand how that changes it. I just don't get that piece, so if someone
Yeah.
would explain it to me.
They don't bring a district trophy home.
But they still could bring the state title home, right?
Yeah, probably so.
My question is, where did the 32 people in boys tennis come from? I mean, is there really 32 boys at the high school that want to play tennis? And how do you know that?
survey.
It's not a guarantee, of course, it is a survey, but at the same time, it's a good enough indicator.
And it's cancelable if we don't meet the number.
Any sport, any year, not just ones we add. Any sport, any year.
Then there's usually trend data over a couple of years to see
Correct.
if it's trending up or if it's trending down. And the only other thing I could share for Mr. Carey would be, in our new conference, a lot of what conferences will do, and I'm not at the meeting, so I don't want to speak to these sports directly, but I know a number of times there's a big grid that shows how many teams that you have. 6 of the 8 teams have volleyball, 3 of the 8 teams have something, all of them divided out. And so one of the goals for a conference is if any of the schools, us or any of the other schools are adding a sport, they tend to try to want people to add sports that will make a full complement within the conference. So these three, I can't speak to and say, if Mr. Rollman talked with the other athletic directors and they said, hey, if you can do some, not hey, I apologize, but if you're going to add, these would be the ones we would recommend. And right now, if there aren't any other teams in the conference that have lacrosse, while lacrosse has been playing and doing well numbers-wise, this might be the fit for the conference that they've had. And again, I can get that information to you if Mr. Rollman had that conversation as far as trying to fill that out. And as we would hope with some of the other schools that don't have multiple levels, if they were to add, they would add to the complement to make the conference stronger, not just consider that along with what their community needs to. So it's balancing both of those things.
Are students made aware that with activities that they can, that they can approach, that it doesn't have to already be existing, that they can approach the administration and say, hey, we've got 5 kids that want to, I don't know.
That's the purpose of the
Start a
survey.
badminton club.
And then in addition to that, I believe that that happens and has happened over the years. That's how many of our clubs or activities have come to be. That very, hey, we have some kids that are interested. Can we come to your room and do our thing for an hour and you sit here with us? And I think that gets to what Mr. Rivas was talking about historically, where these things happen for a period of time, and then once that's kind of got a foothold, it comes before the board for approval as an activity or as athletic.
Thanks.
When does this have to be in place? Meaning, when do we have to last vote on it?
That's a good question. Prior to the start of the school year, I believe would be a have to. But we try to get this in place now because many of these activities run summer programming and camps and those
Sure.
kinds of things.
Understood.
So we want to get that in place.
Hence the question.
Yep.
Now would be ideal for that planning.
Right. The other piece that happens too is the interest becomes a sign-up, and the sign-up becomes hard numbers. So kind of dovetailing to Mr. Carey's question, until we have a program, the kids really can't sign up for it also. So once we do, then they sign up, we have some more hard numbers for that, and then we're able to move from there.
I guess my biggest question is, you're talking about stipends and differentials, but you're not talking about if we approve head boys, boys tennis or bowling, sorry about that. This is just the stipend end of it. We're not getting any idea of what the actual amount could end up being.
And
that's my
we've
biggest
never
problem.
talked about that component with the board. I don't know all the different pieces of that. I wonder if Dr. Fuchs could speak to that a little bit better. But the purpose of this has always been the people part of it, which would be the stipend for the coach.
I've had a conversation with Mr. Rollman regarding these 3 sports in particular. His current budget is going to absorb all of the balls, uniforms, transportation is separate, and then officials. So it will be absorbed within his existing budget. Additionally,
Don't the boosters pay for quite a bit of the transportation?
only for the state events, usually when they advance, yeah. The other thing is the summer camps that Dr. Atkins talked about. The schedule and the signups for summer camps comes out right after spring break. And that's why if there's gonna be a summer camp for any of this, it would be helpful to move it along.
And the rest of the district has these sports as well?
Rest of the conference schools.
Conference,
I can't answer exactly how many, but there are some that I'm sure do, that this would help complement and make the conference stronger. Because generally, to get into a little more information, most conferences have X amount of teams, ours has 8, and there's usually a number at which you can become academic all-conference and athletic all-conference, and it's usually if there's 5 teams or 6 teams, or 6 of the schools have it. So the more schools that when they do add a sport can add towards where the deficiencies are, it just makes your conference stronger too.
I asked Mr. Roman that question today, and all 3 of these sports are in our conference.
But not all, no, not all the schools, right?
I asked him if they were in the conference, and his answer to that was yes, they are all in the conference. I don't know if that means every single
I guess where I'm
school
going with that
district in the
is-
conference participates yet.
I guess where I'm
would
going
guess.
with that is, it sounds like it would be the same situation with lacrosse. If they may, one of the, however many schools we have, may have this team until we're only playing each other back and forth, as opposed to, and then lacrosse, maybe there's not another one, and I don't know that. But then it's the same situation, as far as I'm concerned.
Slightly different in that there would be other IHSA teams. If it's bowling, there's probably 120 bowling teams that they can go against in the state, in the area. Whereas lacrosse, if the lacrosse team didn't 2 years ago become an IHSA team, they would run out of teams to play. So while the Interstate 8 doesn't have lacrosse as a sport, there's enough teams that they can play as long as they stay as an IHSA sport. They would, if they didn't, they would run out of teams to play. So that way, but here, it's not just the conference teams that they would play. They play a number of non-conference teams. So boys and girls tennis and golf, they can play non-conference teams too. So there's more teams to choose from outside of the conference than what lacrosse would have.
So I guess I still don't understand why lacrosse was left off the list and say boys bowling was recommended.
I don't know that it was left off the list because we're still considering it for future years. It just didn't come first because we could get more sports for the available dollars because we're already asking for more dollars. So this was how we could reach a more variety of needs versus just the one.
I didn't understand that answer. Are you saying lacrosse costs as much as these three other sports?
I think it might need as many coaches. It would need a head and an assistant and some of those kinds of things. So it's all on the docket to do. We just had to get we had to go first somewhere. And the choice from Mr. Rollman was to look at these three sports.
If you'll recall too, currently the lacrosse coaches are volunteers, so we don't pay for them. Additionally, we charge more for lacrosse, so it's, right now, it's cost neutral. We charge what we think it's going to cost us to run the
Right.
program.
I remember that.
Once it becomes on this list, we charge the typical fee, and then we pay the coaches, which means then the program costs more than we take in.
Which is, to me, that's the argument
Yeah.
to bring lacrosse in, because I don't think it's a money factor to me, and I don't think running bowling is about whether or not you make money. I think it is what's right for the programs for the kids. And so if lacrosse is the right thing to add, that's what we should consider next. But if Mr. Rollman thinking of many other things than just pure numbers, like head counts, there's 50 here and 43 here, it sounds like he obviously is considered a lot more than that. So I guess at this point, I'm comfortable deferring to his assessment of conference needs and student interests and those sorts of things. But I hear the thinking that we should be considering some of these other sports as well.
Although I think on the lacrosse side, if we don't have, nearby or conference, competition, and knowing going in, it's going to cost a lot more to transport the teams.
Right.
And then, do you take that on when you can, get 3 for 1 and not go so far with these other sports?
My apologies to you, put you on the spot, but I think Mr. Rowland should have been here.
Yeah.
So what are we thinking? Are we ready for a vote, or we want enough people?
If I'm voting right now, I'm voting no, because I don't feel like there's enough information. Going back to the questions I asked earlier, so we can go either way. We can table it or have a vote.
I'm prepared to make a motion.
Okay, good. You're voting, okay. All right, so we will, I'll entertain a motion that the Board of Education approve the stipends and differential recommendations for 2020-21 as presented.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
And roll call.
Mrs. Pavlik,
No.
Mr. Rivas,
No.
Mrs. Sparber,
Aye.
Mrs. Witt,
Aye.
Mrs. Junk,
Aye.
Mr. Carey,
No.
Mr. Lawler,
Aye.
Motion carries 4-3. We'll move on to, thank you. We'll move on to J3 standards-based grading presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Atkins. For our next agenda item, for J3 standards-based grading, I know from at the semester time in December, as grades were due for the first semester, there were a series of questions that the board members had, community members had, staff had, and even administration had to try to support and move forward communicating. So tonight's goal is to bring all of that together for the first time. So I spent a lot of time and effort to get to this point, to be able to share the information. So one thing that I would ask as we have the conversation, if there are individual questions that board members have as far as a student's grade or those kind of smaller details, we'd be happy to address any of those. I know Mr. Raleigh has called back a number of families and communicated with them via email too. So hopefully what we can do tonight is get the bigger picture, timeline, criteria, the goals, the philosophy of standards-based grading, that piece of it. But if there's single questions, we can kind of note those and then answer those later.
Will you be hinting to us what was addressed with those families?
I'm
type of
sure
scenarios?
some of that will
Sure,
come up
yep.
probably as they go through the topic, some of those questions. Mr. Raleigh?
All right, thank you very much. We are here today with our high school teams, so we have Ms. Maris, Ms. Oslager, and Ms. Faber. We've spent a lot of time putting together some foundational information just for clarity of standards-based grading. As you'll see through this, a couple notes to pay attention to. Number one, there's a ton of information in here. We are aware of that, but we wanted to share everything to have it on record as a point of reference. So if there are questions that come up, general questions that come up in the future, we wanted to have a place that housed a lot of that information for parents to access. What we're not going to go through in a lot of detail is the last 6 or 7 slides are a tremendous amount of resources that we've used probably over the last 2 to 3 years to build this presentation, to ultimately help drive decisions that we make not only at the high school, but from elementary all the way up through middle school and high school. So there's a lot of resources towards the end. One thing to note there, because oftentimes we get wrapped up in educational jargon, there is a slide on there in particular in that resource section of key definitions. We're going to be talking about standards-based grading. The title has standards-based learning and grading. The grading portion generates probably the most questions that we've addressed, but it's probably the smallest bit of standards-based practices. I know that we had a conversation last time when we were looking at comparable data and talking about what are some of those instructional practices that have shifted. That's the standards-based learning part. That is the day-to-day interaction that our teachers are having with our students. So we're going to talk through both pieces of those, but know that the grading piece is very important, but that's just, it's a piece of what we're looking at when we're talking about standards-based philosophy and standards-based instruction in general. Again, I attached late here, so it's not in the current presentation that you have, but I put my contact information in there. We were hoping to maybe be able to separate this presentation out and house it so it's more easily accessible to parents, and that would have my contact information. So if there are those specific questions to courses, to teachers, we as a team are happy to address those, so my contact information will be in there. As we go through this, and what we've done over the last couple of years is as we've started to put into place new practices, we've really wanted to link those to our strategic plan, to Kaneland 2020, and a lot of some of the things we're going to talk about have been topics of discussion for our strategic plan as we're working on it for the years to come. What's nice about standards-based learning and standards-based grading is it directly ties into our philosophy and all the work that we've done with personalized learning. It's really small print, and I do apologize for that, but this is the honeycomb model that we use from the Institute, and it is really the framework that we've used to drive our professional development over the last few years. It's what we've used to drive our initial Institute days to kick off the years. And bits and pieces of this honeycomb model, as you work your way out, these pieces are very specific. And there's 4 red ones that we've noted that are highlighted that tie directly to standards-based learning and standards-based grading practices. Of note, the first one that ties in, we want to have customized responsive instruction. So the standards and focusing on standards allows us to target our feedback and target our instruction directly to a specific academic standard that we want kids to understand. The importance of that is that feedback is timely, that feedback is actionable. We've had some data measurement tools in place, so we'll share at the end a bit of that feedback piece and how students have really grown in the action that they've taken in response to the feedback they've gotten from teachers. There is one directly called standards guided learning. We'll break down in this presentation exactly what that looks like and how that's reshifted or refocused some of our instruction in the classroom. And then really one of the key pieces there is that proficiency-based progress, proficiency-based assessment tools and assessment systems. We want kids to be able to master a standard before they move on. So those are a few of them, certainly not all of them, but a few that tie directly to standards-based grading. And what's nice about these is I know we've had discussions in the past of how do we know it's effective. There are great ways to build in some measurement pieces to this. We'll talk about some of the specific ones that we've already done, but this framework really helps drive our delivery of standards-based grading. And what we know, again, before we move on and just why we're doing this, again, this flows naturally with our learner profile, our standards-based progress, and what we know in particular with this standards-guided learning. Educational research, John Hattie, he talks about teacher clarity and expectation clarity, and that is one of the most significant factors for student success. So this overarching umbrella of standards-based grading, it really boils down to how clearly can we articulate what we want students to learn, and how clearly can we articulate that feedback to them so then they can take action off of that. Again, a lot of information in here. Basically, the purpose of standards, we take organizations, the state of Illinois has some, there's national organizations, the National Council for Teachers of Mathematics, the Next Generation Science Standards. These are organizations, they're groups of college instructors, researchers, practitioners, teachers, administrators that decide what they call academic standards. And this is a little bit of that jargon piece, but when you hear Common Core standards, that is an academic standard. If you hear a Next Generation Science Standard or Next Gen Standard, that's an academic standard. We use those, and that is nothing new in Kaneland. We use those academic standards to drive our curriculum development. We've done that for over a decade. What's a little bit new and what terms you might hear that are newer in this year and certainly as we move forward is what we are calling reported standards. So the process, and we'll look at a timeline in a couple slides, what teachers have really done this year is they've taken all of those academic standards, the Common Core standard, the Next Gen, there's social studies standards, there's a lot, and we've really broken those down and seen, okay, there might be 3 or 4 academic standards that fall under the same umbrella, and we wrote those as a reported standard. A reported standard is unique to Kaneland, and it's based off of the academic standard. So the purpose of those standards are to help drive our instruction and build our curriculum maps. It helps us with our feedback, knowing that actionable feedback is very important, and it's a huge indicator of student success. We want to make sure that our feedback is tailored towards those reported standards, again, that are rooted in a lot of these the state and national organizations.
You lost me somewhere in there.
Yep.
You said there were standards that are published.
That are, excuse me?
That are published, or,
Yes, yep.
but you took and wrote your own?
Not
Well,
wrote our
that's where I
own.
got lost.
We took those, and so an example might be a standard on adding adding fractions using a couple different strategies.
Okay.
So in each academic standards is a different strategy. We've compiled those into our reported standards, and it might not say specifically X, Y, and Z, but students can add using a variety of strategies. So we've written that we've written that reported standard to include the nuances of those academics.
Okay.
And then ultimately, and we'll talk about grading, but our summative grades are going to be based on when we report out on the reported standards that were developed. Some key information here. Again, there's a lot here. This talks a little bit about where we're coming from. Our elementary schools have been doing these standards-based practices for over 10 years now. We are in the thick of this transition at the middle school and high school. Our elementary schools are reevaluating, fine-tuning to keep with most up-to-date research. When this change happened, and we have to remind ourselves of this, when this change happened at the elementary school, I think it was 13, 14 years ago now, a lot of the same questions that we're fielding and a lot of the same hurdles that we've experienced were experienced back then. What's different and why we're fielding those is because it's a different set of kids, it's different expectations, it's different practices than what our middle school and high school have been used to. The good news is that it's very common now in our elementary schools. Kids can speak to that. If you ask any of the principals or instructional coaches or people that are going out into the classrooms, the interactions that kids have and the ability that they have to speak to standards is unlike what we've had in the past. A big thing here that we want to hit home on, if you look under a lot of the similar practices now that are going to be rolled into the middle school and high school, those are some of the things we want to take note. And to answer previous questions, a lot of the questions and emails we received were around these pieces. Most notably, number one, or that second bullet point here, that these reported standards are going to have a proficiency table aligned to them. Our teachers are creating proficiency tables for consistency across departments, or consistency across grade levels. And what a proficiency table does is it says once we know and identify what our reported standard is, when we know what we want to grade kids on, we collectively as a team, we are going to say this is the criteria that we're looking at to say that yes, this student is proficient in the standard. Or if they're not quite there, this is what it would look like, this is what it would sound like, this is what learning looks like for a student that is approaching but is not quite there. So we are in the process, and some of the hardest work, and why this isn't such a quick turnaround, is that those teachers have to come to the table and have those conversations. A lot of great work has happened around that already. A lot of these tables are built already. The next step then is pulling in student work samples to kind of vet those tables. But that's been a huge part of our task this year, is taking the standards and then figuring out and coming to a common understanding of exactly what learning looks like at each of those benchmarks. Yes?
I didn't know if you wanted a question.
For sure, yep.
Okay, can you explain how or why we went ahead with the pilot without having those proficiency tables already established? Because it seems like it's hard to give a summative grade without the proficiency tables.
Yep.
And yet that's what we're trying to do without,
Yep.
so I'm sure there's a reason, I just wanted to know.
Yep, and to be fully honest with you, it's probably something we could have had in place a little bit earlier. What we do know is those conversations are happening now. Teachers aren't all on a department or grade level. They're not all grading the exact same. Part of the tricky part with those tables is that we have put a lot of that work in place, and it's making the decisions, the best decisions we know with the information that we have. Now where some of the difficulties have come is we've needed to teach to the standard and then get those work samples in so we can say, this is what we thought it would be. Now that we actually have seen it and instructed students, these are the work samples we're getting back. So then that's that reevaluation piece. We might need to recalibrate what that proficiency piece looks like, where hopefully this presentation and where we've moved since, let's say, November, December, is that we're putting structures in place to be more tight on that timeline, more tight on those practices, where before it might be Jill and I that are, Ms. Maris and I that are doing that. Now we want that common across a department or across a grade span. So if we had twins and one was in my class and one was in Ms. Maris' class, they're getting the same education, they're being graded and reported the same. So that is where we're trying to shore up some of those pieces.
How long have you
And
been
so
working?
you needed the, sorry, you need the real data from a real situation.
Yep.
Rather than just creating those tables from assumptions.
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
thanks.
But haven't you been working on this program, we're in year 3 now, right? At the high school?
The teaching piece, but reporting out on the standards has been,
Well, let me rephrase.
yep,
I'm tying this to grades.
yep.
So this has been, you've been trying to implement this program in the high school as a pilot or across departments for
Yep.
3 years now, is my understanding. I'm just wondering why this isn't already done.
I think in some courses it is done that are a little bit further along. Not everyone was piloting it. I know English was one that has been piloting it for a couple of years now, but it wasn't the entire department. It was individual courses. So they have been doing it for a couple of years, but as far as the proficiency tables, aligning those student work samples, that is now work that's being done as with the entire department. So that's where we're starting to see some of the changes in practices.
So if I jump ahead in your presentation, this will all be done by the end of next school year?
Where we outlined that, because of the number of courses and the number of staff that we had, it's not going to be done by the end of next year. But it is broken down, and that would be communicated out. Our required classes will likely be done in the next 2 to 3 years, but there are some one-off classes that are taught every other year. There's some classes where there's a ton of work and hours that go into writing those proficiency tables, and more that of looking at standard. There's a lot of work that goes into that. We have courses where there's 2 or 3 courses that are taught by the same person. So that one teacher is putting that work into some of the required classes, and then the next year they'd be working on their second course, and then the year after that, the third.
So if I just heard you correctly,
Mhm.
we started about 3 years ago.
Yep.
And you just didn't give me an end date, so we're another, you said at least 2 years?
2 to 3
So
years.
we're talking a 6 or 7 year rollout of a program?
Yep,
So
which
we'll
is
have-
pretty typical. We've talked with a lot of the districts around here. Belvedere High School is one up north that is in I think they're in year 7 or 8, and they're still seeing some of the similar struggles of what we're looking at. Or they've shared with us some of the things they've gone through, and they're now coming out of that. But anywhere between 2 to 7 or 8 years is typical for the transition.
We do curriculum reviews every 6 years. It seems like you should be able to get it done. I guess I don't know I don't have enough information. It just seems like 6 to 7 years to change the grading scale.
Mhm.
You've got entire classes of high school kids going through the system, not knowing which class, which grade, anyway, go ahead, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback on that, I mean, who's actually suffering from this? Our students, because there's fuzziness all over the place, at least what I'm hearing. I mean, we only have one opportunity for these children to go through 9th through 12/graduation, and it just seems like we missed a step there, and hence probably why you're getting all these questions of these parents, because of the frustration. I mean, it just makes no sense.
I can understand that there is frustration, but I would say that there's an equal amount of benefit to the amount of frustration, because there are different sides of it, you know, we were hearing from the parents whose children are being negatively affected. We aren't hearing as much from the parents whose children are being positively affected.
Or do they even have a voice, I guess,
Who? The ones that
the
are being
parents that don't speak up? I mean,
Well, most people don't call to say good things. It's usually you just get the negative
Right,
phone calls,
exactly.
so.
And I fully understand that. I do want to recognize the work of our teachers, that a lot of this work is happening on Thursday mornings before our kids even get to the school. When those kids come in, they're being challenged every day. They're being instructed at a very high level every day. Not to say that it's perfect, not to say that in hindsight, could we have done something differently? Probably, but our kids get a very good education in the day-to-day, the hour-to-hour in their classes. They're still being pushed, they're still being challenged, they're still taking risks, they're doing a good job.
I'm sure they are.
Another thing here that raised a lot of emails and a lot of discussions is that underlying piece of a de-emphasis on homework and formative grades. Formative is one of those things that we'll find at the end. Formative grades are essentially practice. It is assessments that are used to help drive day-to-day instruction. I'm not necessarily giving a reported grade in a grade book on that. Homework is a huge conversation to have, and we could probably talk for the next few hours based on homework philosophy. What we know and what the overwhelming research shows is that homework should not impact a final grade. There's a heavier importance placed on homework at the high school level, but homework can be a huge influence of a grade and not a true indicator of whether or not a student fully understands the standard that's being asked of them. And the example we give is that if homework is graded, I can take that homework home. It's completely out of control of the teacher, and I could have the internet do that homework for me. There's apps that do math homework for people. I could have older brother or sister do homework for me. I could have parents do homework for me, and I could bring that back and get a full credit on that. And truly, I may not understand what that standard is, and I may not truly, it may not be understood by me. On the flip side of that, I could have a lot of homework assigned to me, and I might go home and I might be working and not be able to do my homework. I might have to take care of my brothers or sisters, and I don't prioritize homework, but I might know that standard inside and out and could probably teach it. But my grade then is becoming negatively impacted because of other things that are happening. I can't focus on my homework. So those things are happening in traditional grading systems. So homework, again, it is meant to be practice, and the key piece of why homework is most effective goes back to that timely feedback piece. When homework comes back, it needs to be marked up. It needs to be marked up almost on the spot of what you did well, areas for improvement, how to make that improvement. So there's conferencing that goes with that. But as a impact on grades, we are really, really de-emphasizing that. That is a new practice for a lot of parents. It's a lot of new practices for students. We have reassessment policies in place. We have some professional development that goes with that. But that is a big emphasis to de-emphasize that homework piece because of the impact that it can have on grading.
Does the reassessment typically require homework to be turned in, or not necessarily?
No.
No. So
Why even do it?
So how
But not required. Yep.
how challenging is that in the classroom when for students who probably needed the practice and chose not to do it,
Yep.
so then they reassess,
Yep.
because they learned after the teachers, it puts it seems that it's putting a lot of burden into that assessment
Yep.
piece. If they're making good choices about not doing their homework, fine. If they're making bad choices, it seems to.
Yep. In a couple ways, things that we're looking to do for that. Number one, this is not saying that we can't do homework. This is not saying that homework can't be discussed, scored, debated back and forth of why I got it right, why I think I'm right. We just don't want this to go into that final grade column. The piece that's hard is exactly that. We're changing habits of mind for students. And it's some things that we have that teachers have looked at are entrance criteria into a standard. So you have to show me that you've done these things. You've turned in the majority of your homework in order to get to that final summative. Not all, but some teachers have some of those entrance criterias. The other thing that we're looking at that we don't have fully written yet is We are going to do something very similar to the academic standards with our core values. So we will have respect, responsibility, and commitment to excellence. We will break those down by what does it mean to be proficient in each of those areas by grade span. So my K-5 students are going to know what it looks like to be respectful at the elementary level, which is vastly different than what it looks like here at the middle school and then at the high school. The homework piece, the formative grade piece, that falls into our responsibility grade, and it falls into our commitment to excellent grades, and those grades will be reported to parents. They'll be able to see, I'm getting converting to a C or a D in algebra. My commitment to excellence, my responsibility is also a C or a D, so those are then conversations that we can have with that student to make sure, like, hey, if you're going to be successful, you need to make sure that you are committed to doing the work and being responsible for what the classroom expects.
So teachers don't feel like they're in the constant reassessment loop because students made bad choices to start with necessarily?
Yes, hoping, yes.
Hoping that, okay.
Yep,
You just took me off on a tangent, maybe.
Okay.
But I'm still gonna ask.
yep.
All right, so you said that you're gonna do the letter grades for, let's say, being respectful.
Yes.
All right. How does that figure into their GPA?
It's going to be separate from their academic GPA. It'll be
Okay.
listed on, basically it's an influencer of what those, it's a habit of mind, habit of work practice in that.
Okay.
On my report card, it'll say algebra, here's my reported standards, respect, responsibility, commitment to excellence.
So you could get straight A's and have a horrible attitude and you'll still get a high GPA? Good, well,
Could.
I think
Will
that's
that
how it
show
should
on
be.
But I think that paints a picture of,
Eventually.
yep.
So a student, well, okay, so.
Or you could have a great attitude and
Okay,
be really bad at
well-
math, but.
Well, what I'm thinking of is, a student who may be struggling emotionally or something like that and acting out, but still understands the standards, could be negatively impacted if that is on their transcript, that they, weren't respectful or they had a bad, I can see that, having a negative impact on college entrance.
You'd have a written a narrative that would probably go along with that.
So
With a student.
From the counselor
Yeah.
or something, okay.
I got lost again. So you are reporting the behavioral numbers to colleges?
On transcripts, they said yes.
Okay, that's-
Not yet. Not currently,
Not currently,
It will go on transcripts.
but it will in the future.
eventually.
It seems like a whole nother conversation we should have.
So,
Yep.
yeah, it definitely.
And that work is going on with that plays a role in that lengthy rollout of it is.
It's
So-
not just
Dr. Layden, is that gonna be something that we vote on, whether their behavioral grades get reported out to colleges, or how is that gonna come back? Or is that just something you guys are doing? And
Yeah, that's a part of the process. So it's not necessarily a vote of what part of the report cards we would not want. So it'll be brought back and shared as an update of what it all looked like.
But not vote. Right?
No.
I wanted to mention too about the homework piece, I think, is when I was talking about, students that, the people you don't hear from. And I have 3 kids, I have 3 very different kids. I've had ones that were on task every minute of every day, and I have others who, as some teachers described, had interesting ideas of what deadlines mean. So, however, the kid with the deadline issue could have clobbered the standards, right out of the gate. And so I think it impacts, if we're talking personalized learning, you're holding those students back if they're being required to go back and do homework, because those kids that don't. Anyway, we're not hearing from the parents who say, oh, my kid got a C because they didn't do the homework when they aced every test. Yeah, that's what I meant by you don't hear from the positive end of it, so just want to make, those parents are out there.
And then the last bullet piece underneath there that we want to call attention to is the focus on mastery learning, proficiency learning, reassessments and feedback. Some of the questions that we responded to from our community were some inconsistencies here. So just of note there, and again, this is re-highlighted in the reference section, those decisions are going to be by grade span or by department. And why that's important is because we have looked at and we've piloted a couple different structures, and the issue we've run into is, again, a student in Class A might have a different experience than in Class B. So by department, those are going to be decided. So there might be some nuances between, let's say, math and ELA, but the whole math department, as opposed to Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, instead of having all of those different courses make a decision, the math department is going to have a policy. Those policies are going to be stated in the syllabus. Those policies are going to be communicated out to parents. So while it might be different when I go from math class to my English class, I know that my math class as a freshman is going to be the same as my math class as a junior, is going to be the same as a senior. So there's a little bit of teacher autonomy to that piece, but we do, in order to clear up some of the misunderstanding, those are going to be realigned by department. Next piece, again, is just a little bit more why we've made this shift. This information on traditional grading systems versus standards-based grading systems. Traditional grading is usually rooted in points. I get 100%, I get a 90%, and those points can be, or not always, but you can earn points that aren't necessarily directly tied to a learning standard. It could be extra credit, it could be a variety of different things, but not always are the points directly aligned to a learning standard. The credit for standards-based, when I'm talking a 4-3-2-1, all of those are directly tied to a learning standard. What you will often see is compliance that goes and impacts learning, and not necessarily truly understanding the academic piece. What I mean by compliance is you turn an assignment. If you're talking in class, I'm going to take 5 points off of your class, or I'm going to take 5 points off the assignment, or if it's past a deadline, I might take some points off of it. So there are pieces that can impact true learning in a traditional point system. Timeline for Kaneland. So we are rooted in this work right now. We kicked off our Institute Day in August, doing something called a real process, and I'm happy to share that process with you, but essentially it's taking those academic standards.
You skipped a whole bunch of slides.
Did I?
Yeah.
Yep.
It's because I feel like I've been talking a bunch.
I'll give you that. Or did you add a slide?
We moved it from your presentation, this was.
Okay.
Oh.
Got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so what page should I go to?
Okay, he's like, thank goodness. 12.
We moved it because it made more sense earlier, but you
Oh,
had
the
already received
timeline?
The timeline, yeah.
Okay, I do apologize.
No, that's fine, just
We're just gonna
point you in the
type
right direction.
But we just moved it up.
Perfect.
Okay. that's
12.
here.
So, implementation timeline, broken down by grade span. So our EC5, our elementaries, our middle school, and our high school, we've all gone through a training to take those academic standards written by the state and national organizations, to vet them through a process to determine what our reported standards are going to be. And what we've, a quick overview of what that looks like are, do the standards transfer to multiple areas, or is it a one-time, one-and-done standard that I'm looking at? So we want them to be able to transfer across content, across curriculum. We want to make sure that they are standards that are being addressed by standardized tests, by ACTs, bits and pieces like that. So we've gone through that process with teachers at all of our levels, early childhood through 12th grade. Our support staff is doing this, our speech pathologists, our social workers, anybody that has contact with kids are going through some type of standard that are associated with their organization to figure out what we want our reported standards to be. Again, based on the sheer number of courses at the middle school, in particular the high school, that timeline then gets extended because there's so many of those compared to the number of staff members that we have teaching those. At the middle school and high school, you'll see our elementaries have been standards-based for a while now. They've been refocusing some of the reported standards. They're more in the process of pulling in that student work. Some of the courses at the middle school and high school are doing something similar. The middle school and high school, the focus is going to be on drafting those tables. Again, we want to focus on consistency, so no matter where I go, the proficient, approaching proficient, those are clearly defined, and that criteria is clearly defined for all of our stakeholders. And then the last piece there for the middle school and high school is preparing to shift from those traditional grading systems to reporting out on the standards. What our team will get into is what that conversion looks like. Feedback we've gotten in working with universities is that sometimes there is a difficulty with a transcript that is the 4321 of just the standards-based piece. We are going to convert those for the purpose of a GPA at the high school and the purpose of a transcript at the high school. We will live standards-based on a day-to-day basis, but when it's time to produce those papers, we will convert what the standards-based grade is to a traditional letter grade and to get a GPA and a transcript to send off to the colleges.
So I guess maybe I missed something there. So what will first semester freshmen see on their report card? Is it just when you get to the reporting at the end it will convert?
Yep, they will likely see the reported standards.
On their report card, like the elementary school?
Yep.
Will they have the calculator, if you will, to convert?
We can share it out. We've shared it out with our staff, yep.
So
Students.
every quarter are you gonna do that, every year? I'm sorry, what?
It's about the students.
No, I got, and my question was, are you gonna do that every quarter, every year? How often are you gonna make those calculations available to the students?
Report card time when
So it's gonna
depending
be, you're not gonna do one for the first 3 quarters and then get your grade at the end kind of thing?
Mhm.
Still, it would follow the traditional method of semester.
Yep.
Okay.
And then does the school profile that is, that always goes out with the transcript, is that being rewritten? Will it explain, even though they're seeing a traditional grade, kind of seems like they should know what went into it. Will they see that and how the calculations were?
Yep, we can.
The school profile gets updated every year, so as more and more courses get added.
Okay.
I had one more question.
Yep.
Under the EC5, it
Yep.
says you're vetting the proficiency tables.
Yep.
But you also said you've been doing that for 10 years. What have they been doing for the last 10 years?
We are, the proficiency tables started this year. The last 10 years, they've been reporting out on standards. The EC5 report card is a little bit cumbersome because it lists every Common Core standard in math, and some of those have been assessed, some of them haven't, but they're all listed there. So that reporting out on those standards has been practiced at the elementary for the last 10 years. The proficiency tables were just written this year, and they've taken all of those Common Core academic standards and whittled them down or clumped them down to a reported standard. So now that they have those, they're taking the student work against the proficiency table itself, not the standards. Does that make sense?
I think. So is the
Okay.
report card gonna change then and not have all of the,
It will, yes, it will report the reported standards, not the 30 or 40 Common Core standards.
okay. Then then it makes sense.
Okay.
These next 2 slides are going to spend some time talking about what does it look like to live in a traditional grading world, and the next one will be what does it look like to live in a standard-based grading world. Last December, when we went to the Learning Forward conference, Carrie and Krista and I had a chance to sit in on a standard-based grading session, and it was actually, I don't know if they were high school or.
They were both high school.
Both high school out east. And they have actually written a book about standard-based grading that we have used. They do a lot of talking and workshops and presentations, sometimes to boards, sometimes to staff, sometimes to community. So it was a great resource for us to go and just kind of pick their brain and hear some of how they have explained this. One of the analogies that they use that has been very helpful for me is looking at this as a bank statement versus a GPS.
In a traditional world, we have a tendency to look at our grades as kind of like a banking system. Students know if you put in so many points, that's going to translate into a certain grade. Everything that we're doing is giving them feedback on how are you doing on those points and how does that turn into a grade. They tend to be very teacher-driven as far as the creation of what those points look like. You're going to see the feedback be more about how did you lose points or how did you gain points. The conversation is very rarely about what did you learn and what did you apply using that information. It's about the points. And if you think about it, I firmly believe that part of our struggle from our parents has been everybody wants to support our students, and we know how to support students in a traditional way. That's how we went to school. And so when we have those conversations with our students, it tends to be something along the line of, what percentage are you at right now, and how do you get to that next percentage? What do you need to turn in and do? How do you gain more points in order to raise up to that next level? If you think about it on the next slide being more the standard base, thinking of it as more of a GPS. So we're going to go on a trip. In order to go on a trip, we need to find out first, where are we starting? I might be starting in a different spot than where you're starting, but we all have a starting spot, and it's important to start the lesson with the teacher and the students, knowing globally where are people starting and individually where are they starting. We also want to define where is it that we're trying to go to, and make sure that the students and the staff and everybody knows what is our end target. That's going to be our standards. Along the way, we're giving feedback on how we are doing on that trip. Are you staying on the right path? How close are you to your target? What's your evidence that you're getting close to your target? If you think on a trip, if all of a sudden I miss a direction and I take a wrong turn, I need some feedback. How do I get back on track? And to let me know that I am on track. And that's truly what standard-based grading is all about. It's desiring for the conversation to be about what's our ultimate goal and what we're trying to learn, and how are we on that path from where we started to where we're trying to get in that learning. How are we gathering that evidence to show that we are on the right track, that we have actually hit that target, that we have reached proficiency for that standard, and how do we know that? So now think about that conversation at home, because we know this is that everybody wants to support them. The conversation now is more about, what is your standard? What are you learning in class right now? What evidence do you have that you're actually heading in the right direction? What evidence do you have that you have actually shown proficiency on that standard? What evidence could you show? Can you help me to understand when you look on Canvas or on Tyler, look at the feedback that you're getting from your teacher, can you show me how you are doing on that standard based off of that evidence? So the goal is really to move the kids towards more of that GPS mentality, and our students and our community in being able to have that conversation as opposed to the bank account one that we traditionally did.
Question. So you have a teenager. As a mom, I'm doing fine. I mean, can a parent also go into and look at and try to analyze things, I guess? And
Absolutely.
talk to the counselor?
Absolutely. Yeah. With a lot more depth, because now my conversation is not, okay, you're at a 92%, how do you keep that 92? Or you're at an 87, how do you get it to a 92? My conversation is more about, what are you actually learning? How are you applying that learning? How are you showing the evidence that you're learning that? And how can I support you in moving that forward? It's a lot more concrete and not as abstract as it might have been. But it felt very comfortable because that's what we knew.
Right. And going back to your first view graph, the old way, if you will. If I think back in my geometry/trigonometry classes, there's a buildup. If you didn't catch that stuff, you're not gonna be able to do the next thing. So I can equate that to the standards, if you will. Obviously, you might call it a percentage or whatever, getting there, whatever is half of the class or whatever, and apply the percentage to it, but it's still there. So,
Pedro, that's actually an excellent example, because in our old way, the feedback would have often been, you got a 69% on that test. What was the part of the test that you didn't understand? What's the part that you really need to reassess? What's the part that you need some more support, some more training on? Because especially in math, that's going to show up later on, right? So we got to make sure that those skills are really solid and they're ready to move on. And with the standard-based grading, it changes the conversation, so we're talking about those skills and that application of that learning, and not just on that overall test score. So even when they're taking tests now, they're standard aligned. So I might be able to tell you overall, you got about an A on this test, but I can tell you within this standard, this is how you did on this standard, this is how you did on this standard, this is the part that you need to reassess because you didn't do well, or this part you nailed it, you're ready to go on.
So if you have, you brought up a test, if you have a test that had 3 standards on it, and you nailed a couple of them, got your 4, if you will, but the other one you're at 2, what's your overall score there?
Well, you can go back and you can reassess that
That
too.
was my question.
It depends. It's a picture over the whole year, or the whole semester too. It's not
Initially
just.
failed, though.
No, not
Altogether,
necessarily.
right?
Not necessarily.
If you do an average, you do, right?
We're not averaging.
Okay.
We're not averaging. There's a conversion
Well, that's
chart
what
we'll show you.
students- That's what students have been walking away with, our students.
And I think there has been a lot of confusion that, for the most part, has been clarified, that we need to continue to clarify. Because a lot of it has been the fear of the unknown, too.
So on that note, how do you support parents to know what questions to ask? Because I think you have to, it assumes a very high level of savvy for this, and then, you know, it's hard enough to get parents to come in for anything, you know, people are busy, and
Absolutely.
it seems like they need some training on how
Yeah.
to.
And there's
Talk
been
with their
some,
students.
there's been some times that we have done some of that training, and I think one of the things that we struggle with is how do you get people to want to come and learn? And I think the good thing is, truly, the really good thing is people want the answers now, and that's a good thing. And so we're ready to give those answers. Our primary focus so far has been to make sure that the students understand it, so that if the students can explain it to their parents, and then when the parents call, we can explain it as well. But yeah, definitely, that's just an area we can continue to have a conversation.
There've been I don't know, I don't think it's been all, but a few teachers, well, definitely teachers have pushed some stuff out via email, but there's been a few where I've had to sign that I read, whatever it is, especially around November time. And so I do feel like there was some proactivity to get into the parents' hands of, you know.
Parent newsletters for
specifically
the
on this
last,
Yes, it was their conversion table, and do you see where we've assessed these and not these, and this is kind of where
Okay.
your kid is at. That was helpful to me. I mean, it was like 2 full pages for one class, front, back, you know, to kind of see, to understand sort of the standards that was being taught. That wasn't every single class, but I do think there was some pushed out this year that I think was, to me, really helpful. But I feel like I still have the background knowledge, so there was a lot to learn.
we have included
Yeah.
information in our parent newsletter every time for the last 2 years. The issue really becomes if you don't have the place to apply that knowledge.
Yeah.
It's hard to really
I
learn it.
agree.
And so
Yeah.
now we're trying to apply what we've learned, and that's why we've also included all the resources in here, not only for you guys, but for the community as well, to be able to access that information.
So at this time, we've shared a lot of information, so we thought it would be good to take a break and kind of summarize where we are at and what remains the same with standards-based grading, and then what are a few of the focal points that are going to be different before Mrs. Oslager goes into some more of those logistics. So our focus, obviously, in Kaneland still remains graduate all of our students college, career, community ready. That is not changing. We have rigorous standards, as Mr. Rowley discussed. We still want our students to be involved and engaged in the classroom discussions, collaborating with their peers, their teachers, their families about what they're learning every day, and complete those formative assessments, i.e. what we used to call homework, or that practice work throughout the week to build and reinforce those skills. Students are still going to be assessed on their work, a test, a paper, a project. They will receive a grade. That grade is a 1, 2, 3, or a 4. All of those 1, 2, 3s, or 4s will be combined together to issue one letter grade at the end of each semester, just like we always have. And I think that second to last bullet point is the one that's the scariest, so we want to make sure that we really emphasize this. Students will still have a GPA, Their transcript will remain the same as what it always has, except for potentially adding those core values on it. But if you looked at a student's GPA and transcript next year versus 3 years ago, it will be the same. And that's the piece that's scary, so we want to make sure everybody knows that part. And then that the teachers, as always, have done a good job of communicating what they expect students to learn in their classroom. That will all continue. So all of that really good foundational work is still there. But if we can go to the next slide and look at the two main areas that are different. Classes that are implementing standards-based grading, again, that's on that implementation timeline that Mrs. Oslager will talk a little bit about later. Students will receive a 4, 3, 2, or 1 on their summative assessments instead of getting a traditional A, B, or C on that assessment. But again, that will still convert to a traditional letter grade and a transcript just like we've always had. And then the focus is truly back to what Mr. Rowley said at the beginning of the presentation. Our focus is really on that actionable feedback and that we are expecting all of our students to show proficiency. And if they don't, what is that reassessment and relearning process to get to proficiency? So those are the two main changes that we have with standards-based grading. Mrs. Oslager will now describe a few of the logistical pieces.
So this is a chart that was included. It just has some back and forth in between what traditional and standards-based would look like. A couple of the things to point out would be in traditional, and similar to what we talked about with the bank situation, is that it is a situation where it usually is a one and done. And we're all guilty of that in our own schooling, of memorizing everything you could the night before the test, spitting it out, and then boom, see you later. I have no idea what I just put down on paper. So part of that is that usually you only got one opportunity for that test. You didn't get a chance, even if you didn't know something, you still went ahead and took that test. It's not to say that in standards-based you're not getting that opportunity as well to take that test, but you've gotten feedback up to that point specific to certain targets and learning I can statements and standards that actually allow you to know, okay, I'm ready for this test. Similar to what we talked about, part of the process of what our teachers are doing are separating and putting those assessments and writing them so that they're blocked by standards, so that it allows a student to be able to go back and say, this is what I'm at, this is what standard I did get, this is what I missed. Not everyone's at that point yet because we have so many different people in different places, but that is the bigger goal. Some courses are more ahead than others. A lot of times in traditional, what you'll see is a mix of the academic, the behavior, I turned in my work on time, I showed up late, I got 5 points off, all of that combined in one grade. The idea with standards-based grading is that you're focusing your attention on the academic learning and that academic standard, and that you will have some way of reporting what those behavior pieces would be. Part of what we have talked about is that eventually we would like to see that on the transcript. That's not something that's going to happen immediately because that's a process and that takes some work to get through. Also with traditional, you talk about the idea that everything goes in the grade book, you know, every little thing, participation, all that stuff. And whereas with standards-based, it really focuses on the process that we've gone through, which talks about reported standards, which are based on those larger, bigger Illinois and or national standards. This is a chart from an author, Ken O'Connor, and he's one of the resources that are on there. And you could get, it's a little thin book about how to grade for learning and practices. It's not really too thick for you, but if you like reading. But this is kind of a compilation of that to show a visual, especially for other people. We don't need to go through line by line. For the next one, this is what some of you were kind of asking in regards to courses. So what we have done and what we included, and we put it back in the resources page. So these are courses right now that are preparing. Where we started was we started with our required courses. And through the course of last year up through this year, yep.
When you say preparing, are they using standards-based grading?
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
So in these courses, we have some that have actually gone through the process, and like for English, they have actually begun to report all of that way because they have done this work in advance because they were piloting earlier. Math, the majority of those courses are using some form of standards-based reporting through there. And so for these, we do have some courses that are simply just preparing, and they will be preparing to implement for next year. So we are going to always have a situation where we have some that are still going to be in traditional and some that are moving towards that standard space. Everybody, say for example, personal finance. We have 3 teachers and they also teach App of Tech. And so App of Tech is the next one that they would like to work on, but they're doing a lot of work in personal finance, so they chose that one first, and then we'll do App of Tech next for that group of 3. Digital graphics is, for example, is one person. She's able to kind of manage and do that on her own and has worked pretty deeply with that, so that's one that's be able to go a little bit sooner. And so all of these courses, our world language departments are actually piloting and using reporting through standards base this year with 4321. Our special ed lab classes are using it. Fine arts is using the language and they're using the 4321, but not necessarily converting it into Tyler at this point. They're using the conversation. Science is working on that and working on getting their reported standards together, and those 2 courses would be going for reporting next year. So in the back, in the resources, is the actual section of what it looks like to prepare. Didn't necessarily want to go through all that, but in a nutshell, they take all the standards, kind of like Mr. Raleigh was talking, they take all the standards, they sit down, and they go through all of them, and they start prioritizing through the process. And in that process, they start determining what sort of bubbles up to the top.
So if they don't have proficiency tables for, say, driver's ed, how is there consistency among what the teachers are doing?
Consistency, and there's consistency across courses. So driver's ed will be a course that's going to be preparing for the following year. So
I have no idea what you're saying. I'm sorry,
Okay.
you're losing me.
So these
So-
are the courses that right now are preparing.
So, all right, let me pick a different one. Let's say science, biology. Are they using standards-based grading or are they not?
The NGSS biology is preparing this year. Next year, they're planning to implement it.
So they're not using it is the answer to their question.
This year, right now, they are not. They're preparing to use it for next year.
Think English is, if you want to select that one.
Okay, so let's use English. 12th grade AP Lit. Are they using it or not?
This year, they are not. Next year, they will be.
So they're building their tables right now?
They are done with their tables. They completed them this year.
During the school year, you mean?
Yes.
All right, so I guess my bigger question is if you have a class, English, doesn't care which one, that you don't have the proficiency tables done, how are you getting consistent grading among the different teachers?
You're doing it by course. So they're working in groups by course. So it's not all so English 9 works and gets all of their tables and their stuff based on the standards for 9.
But I think,
No, my question is a kid taking it right now and you don't have the proficiency table and you have 2 teachers teaching the same subject, how do you get consistency among the 2 teachers?
that's part of
Right.
why we're going to this shift. That happens in schools across
But
the
even
state where.
before
it's-
standards-based grading, you try to have uniform grading based
Correct.
on
Well, yep.
standards.
Yes.
But
But
even,
you will run into it
PLCs.
in a class where teacher A is grading one way versus B is grading something different. So that's a huge point in the teacher clarity piece. If we think way back to that honeycomb in the feedback piece, that's one of the main reasons we have made this shift is because there could be inconsistencies. Our teachers meet in a professional learning community to have those conversations, but because there are some of those inconsistencies, that's a very valid and fair question, we want to put these pieces in place so they can be aligned and consistent across the board. And that's where some of that rollout takes place, is that we can put our best projected idea of what our consistent feedback is going to be, or what we all believe proficient looks like. Now we need to actually teach it and get those student work pieces back to say what we thought is correct, or our expectations were way too high, our expectations were way too low. We need to tweak that a little bit. But you could run into a course where kids are graded differently between 4 different teachers. Now we want to realign that and have those conversations. So no matter where, if my schedule has to change, or I have to go from my class to Ms. Maris's class, now they're not missing anything in their education. So this process is hoping to shore that up.
Okay.
but you're saying never in Kaneland High School history has that happened before now?
It has happened.
Exactly. I mean, it
Yes,
seems
it
like
has.
this isn't.
This is not, this is the
Yeah.
piece where we started by saying standards-based learning. Standards-based learning has been a practice that has been in place and has been working through Kaneland High School for 7, 8 years.
Yeah.
It's now what the shift is that now you're talking about actually changing some of that instruction to change the reporting, which then change your conversation from teacher to student. So, so these are the teachers and the courses that have been doing all of this work, whether it started last year through this year, and are preparing to fully go for it next year. They've got their tables ready. Some have been able to pilot already, some are trying, but a lot of what they have is they're talking about is that student evidence that's coming back that's helping to support their ideas and what it is that they had down in those standards themselves. So that is this group of people. The next group is who I've identified by department where they're ready to move on next. And so, for example, like I mentioned, App of Tech being one, they need, in our process, is that, say the 3 people for personal finance are working, so they will implement next year, and they will spend their time working and vetting their tables based on the student evidence that comes back. Because it is only 3 people, and they also do teach the App of Tech, they're not positive that it'll necessarily be ready to go the following year, so we want to make sure to give them that latitude to be able to get those courses in place that they have and they're ready to go. So it's not going to be a quick fix because you can't, the time is not there and the staff is not there. We've got people that teach multiple courses. So, and the amount of courses that we have, you don't do them all at one time because it takes actual time and work to read through those standards, deconstruct, build them back up, turn them into learning targets, get all the tables built, etc. So these are the groups that I've identified that would next be preparing. This would be a conversion chart. So this is our initial conversion chart that we have, and this is based on information that we've gathered that our staff has provided who are piloting and using different ways of trying to convert our 4321 into a traditional letter grade because we still are using that process with Tyler and even with Canvas. And so this is still something that we're working on and tweaking because there could be, we've worked through tons of scenarios to try and figure out what about this, what about that. We're still working on those and we still are looking to get, feedback from our staff and be like, okay, what's something you can think of? How do we work through this? So this is our, administratively, staff asked, hey, we've gotten this far. We really, really have done a lot of work. This is a part that we are really struggling with. Can you guys please just come up with something and help us so that we can move on to the most important stuff, which is the instruction piece, because they were kind of getting stuck on how do I convert this. And so in the process of creating it, it deals with the idea of 3s and 4s, looking at that proficiency and above, and then also talking about what that letter grade would turn out to be. Again, it is an initial stage, so I'm sure if you were to sit down and start crunching numbers or figuring things out, it's not an average, it's a logic model, and it's an idea of actually having those 3s and 4s combination, 2s being lower, and then I can go to I know you guys have the paper slide, the paper piece, but the next one is what those numbers would stand for. And so at the high school, we are starting with 1 as a needs improvement and the explanation that's there. 2, approaching, demonstrating partial proficiency. 3, being proficient, and that is across the district, EC 12, proficient is a piece there, is fully demonstrated content proficiency and skill application. And then a 4, meaning that you have demonstrated in depth and you've gone above and beyond. We received a graphic from one of our teachers which was extremely helpful. So if you look at number 1, like a kid on a trike. This guy's little helmet on, he's on a trike because he can't handle it, so he's on a trike. Number 2 would be a kid on a bike with training wheels, still needs help. Number 3 is a kid riding his bike without training wheels and just riding cool, not falling down. Number 4 is a kid on the bike popping wheelies and jumping and doing all sorts of stuff like that. And so that kind of goes above and beyond. We thought it was a really excellent visual. We just need a chance to throw it on here, but just to kind of look at it that way.
He sent it to us this morning.
Right, it was very helpful. And so that's the language that we're talking about commonly that we have. And we do have some groups right now that are using 4321. We know that some groups started last year when they were piloting, they used 321. And so we know that's been an adjustment, and we hope at least we feel that those people that have changed and adjust that have actually communicated that very well. But we know that this is the piece, and we talk about that scale, when we have that, these would be our definitions. Yes,
Maybe it goes to the last slide, but.
okay.
Could that be subject specific or discipline specific, or are we trying to make it so it's?
This one right here?
Yeah.
So this one would be overall.
Okay.
But there is some piece in here where we have to have conversations when it talks about mostly 3s and 4s, so there
Right.
is some level of autonomy.
Okay.
We just have to work through that yet.
Sure, okay.
Because we know that we have a specific, issues where we don't want to have 1s or 2s. If you're going above and beyond, then we believe that if you don't get it, or you're only starting to get it, that's not really
Right.
going above and beyond. So that will require some massaging as we keep working through that, but it's that combination of 3 being proficient, where if you are in a truly personalized learning environment, 3 could move you on. In some of our cases, like, US history, you're at US history, and in our traditional system, you stop at the semester, and so do they go above and beyond within the class? Okay, then they might do 4s on certain standards.
Kind of following up on that, is there a best practice for like how many standards are like a good rule of thumb?
There is not.
Okay.
There is
I
not.
was wondering about this.
Different experts will tell you different things. Some will
Okay.
say 10, some will say 15, some will say 7.
Are these arbitrary or?
It depends on where you're coming from. So Gusky's one of them. He's an author that's big in with this stuff, and he talks about, 10 to 12 being manageable. A lot of it has to do with teacher manageability and student manageability.
Sure.
And part of that is making sure that students understand the pieces that they're going through, and if they know that, then it might be 17 standards, as
Right.
long as they are clear on it. We're just not quite sure where that fit. And these are reported standards.
You
So,
could have other ones that are building towards a bigger standard. so
yes,
that's not required.
supporting standards. So you would have your reported pieces, and then similar to what Mr. Raleigh was saying about, I know this is a little education-y, but with all the common core pieces, so you look at them and teachers go through and they find, okay, these have commonalities, these have commonalities. Let's put them together and put all the little pieces supporting. And so as they're giving that formative feedback, it's all in the supporting pieces, and those numbers then help them guided to that overall reported standard. You are getting a 3 because you showed on these formative pieces that you're at a 2 and a 3, and you worked yourself up, and then you're at a 3.
All right, so walk me through the bottom line of this chart with the kid that has 4 standards and got a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4. Explain how.
Yeah, that's the part that that's why I was just saying, like, if you're gonna go through intricate details, that's always gonna end up being pieces. These are things that we're still working through.
I don't find that an intricate detail. I'm asking a question about how you figure out someone's grade based on the chart you're showing me.
Okay.
So
So
some
you
have a class that has 4 standards. This is the number of any combination of 3s and 4s. So if I'm in a class that is only reported out in 4 standards, I have to have all 3s and 4s in all 4 of those in order to get an A. If I need at least 3 and then no more than a single 1 to get a B, and then any combination. I could have 2 3s and 4s, a 1 and a 2, 2 3s and 4s, 2 2s, 2 3s and 4s, 2 1s would be a C, and then a D would be at least a 3 and a 4, and then a combination of 1s and 2s after that.
So if the kid got 1 4 and 3 1s, where does he end up on that chart?
1 4 and 3 1s
Yeah.
would be a D.
Makes sense.
And that's the part that maybe at first is a little confusing, because this is not like getting a 1. This means 1, 3, or 4.
And what happens then when I have less, these become pretty weighty and everything that encompasses one of those 4 standards.
So I think this is like challenging for parents. When I said I got a communication in November, that was
Yes.
helpful to me. I got like a teacher putting like every mathematical possibility
You got the chart, right? With
in
all
like
the
half
logic
sheet,
numbers.
and
Yes.
you were like, okay, like I'm looking at streams of numbers, and you could start to visualize, because.
Correct. Yes.
And it's not, I mean, I feel like to some extent that's saying you're almost back to teaching to a percentage, but, or communicating to a percentage, but at least it got you understanding, you could zoom in, you could have a better conversation with your student once you understood how those numbers worked out. And okay, we're looking at this, have you learned that yet? When do you how did you feel like you did on it? Like then it helped the conversation, but looking at that was pretty hard to translate that into a conversation with
Yes.
a student.
For the intent of this, we wanted to over-communicate, and that's why it probably appears fairly wordy. We can streamline some of that.
In a class, that
Yeah.
one class would have already known the number of
Correct.
standards, so you could just
Right.
be on one line of that to start with and blow it out.
And there's a
Yeah.
piece, I
Yeah.
think that's a piece of the bigger feedback too, as we're going through this, like how, especially for somebody seeing it the first time and for us going through it, it's where we're at, it's where we figured things out, but as we continue and receive that, like how do we tweak it to make it more, maybe this is just our overall, and then each one communicates in a way that's a little bit more user-friendly, we want to just get the overview so that we had this idea that is in the process, we do have it, we just now, the little details on the backside.
And maybe somewhat to what Jill said, the first day of school, I still might not have fully comprehended, but when I got it, my kid was already 2/3 of the way through the standards. So then I was
Yeah,
like,
things
okay,
plug
I've
in.
got 2/3 of this filled out. Now we're talking.
Right.
Like, but yeah.
And you're
it's-
absolutely right, that I would
it's-
say even for
yeah.
us talking about it, it is a process, and
So
it
if you
would be, you would have to do examples.
Yeah.
Just like you're asking, like, what if I'm here, I do this, and this, that would be this. Like, it would require an educational process, not just for individual classes, but if that's our overall conversion, we would need to do that.
Yeah.
And we've had at the high school parent nights the past 2 years, 4 classes that were talking about this and going through it. So we hope this year that we'll have a large attendance. That we'll have that
So a
noticed.
teacher or a individual is doing this from a teaching perspective to end up with the grade. It is, this is mumbo jumbo to me.
I know.
It is straightforward, they can boom, 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 this is where you're at. It's not subjective, because you're a bad
It-
student,
right.
type of thing, I'm gonna tweak you a little bit, type of thing.
And that's where that 3s and 4s piece, but then also talking about if you're doing A, no 1, you can't have a 1 or a 2 in a standard if you're going to get an A. So kind of making it sure that it's that higher level of rigor and pushing that higher to actually understanding versus completing things.
That's what Jill's alluding to, you can retake the test.
Yes, if you've done some reasoning, yes.
So are you tracking, like seriously tracking the data, like by individual student, by students who started with the other, not standards-based grading and who then moved to it, so that you can see the patterns and that, and actually see the learning and then
Yes.
actually align them to assessments, whether they are our assessments or mandated assessments, or college entrance exams or things like that, so that you can actually see the patterns and what exactly is working.
What's very good for us and for our teachers and even for students in talking about some of those big tests like SAT or whatever, you actually know what it is that you don't know, and you know what you do know. Whereas before, you got an A, and that was an A. And now you could break it down and say, I know how to read contextual evidence, but I don't know how to annotate.
But are you saying, are you going to see that in evidence? I mean, this is.
Yes, and we are, so just kind of saying like, we'll keep that, but we will see that, but you also, our English department, because they kind of were ahead of the game, have been collecting quantitative information from kids, information from them over the course of time. And then we have to see in regards to that process, where it is in regards to, right now, the data would be kind of grades, but eventually would see it reflected in that SAT. Because now SAT breaks it down specifically for us.
And so even a counselor could look at that information, look at what the student was proficient on, and actually tailor an SAT prep plan for that student.
They can do it, yep,
Like they
students
could
can do it right
say,
on
you
Khan
know,
Acad, yep.
You know how to do this, here's where I think you should focus in order
Yes.
to go
I
here.
think
Yes.
it then bleeds into RTI and MTSS, where before we're referred for math. Now I'm referring, and this is speaking EC 12, where I might go through a 6 or 7 week intervention on phonics or on adding. Now, I may not need that full 7 weeks of intervention. I might need a 1 week specific intervention for adding triple digit numbers. So as we start to break those assessments out by standards of where kids are successful and where they're not, we can really start to tailor and personalize that direct instruction, not direct instruction, but that personalized instruction to that student. Rather than, oh, here's test A, if we don't do well, I'm gonna give you the full test B to see if you know it. Here's what you haven't done, you didn't do 1, 3, and 17. I'm gonna write a similar question to reassess you in those after you've shown some learning progression.
Is this chart being used right now with the classes that are using standard?
This is not.
No, it is not.
It will
So
be
how
for
are they
next year.
converting the standards-based currently to a letter grade, to a percentage, to a class rank?
Different logic models.
Yep. So
So
that's
So-
where an inconsistency piece
Right,
comes in.
that's what-
play.
Wait, one at a time.
Excuse me, that's where the inconsistency would come into play right now, is that usually by KLC, by learning communities, they're coming up with, by course, they're coming up with what that criteria looks like for a grade conversion.
So that's
So
why.
there is no standard right now as to how you're converting this into
Correct.
grades?
Correct.
Within each course, so that's why I was saying is that this is the initial piece of that, so right now, each course has gone through and they have gotten to a point where, as they were doing their work, they were ready for an overall conversion. They wanted to have something that was larger and bigger so that they convert to a grade. They have, right now, because we needed pilots to work through some of those things.
Who is they?
Math, English,
So you have math teachers that are all coming up with their own rubrics to figure out how to get from this to,
no, it's by course, and they've worked toward getting it by department.
So all of Algebra 1 would be using
Okay,
the
so
same
that's-
idea. All of Algebra 2 could be using something different. This will make sure that all math courses, no matter what they are using this. Right now, we are currently running into an issue where that algebra class might be different than the Algebra 2, that might be different than AP Stats. So all of the department will be using this. Now there are some of those
Consistency.
inconsistencies between courses
and that's going away when?
next year.
We'll be
And all,
using
all
this.
across the building next
That
year?
all courses that are implementing standards-based will be using that.
No.
So the answer is no, because you still haven't told me when this is gonna be fully implemented across the
Right, so
building.
100, every single course we have, over 80 will not be using those. The first ones that we'll be implementing was the first chart of 30-ish
Yeah.
that are on
I
there.
didn't count them, so.
Okay.
The final piece is taking a look to see how this is impacting students. There's, again, in the reference, the resource page, there's a lot of resources. There's a lot of research that goes into standards-based grading, the effect that it has. There's some very specific research by John Hattie. You're talking a meta-analysis with sample sizes in the hundreds of millions of students over the last 20 years or so. But we wanted to pull some concrete data from Kaneland students. So these next two slides are asking the same questions to a sampling of 1,200 students last February, and then February of 2019 versus February of 2020. So we interviewed students, and this was looking at the feedback to specific learning standards in their classes, and then what they have done with that, what action have they done with that. So in February of 19, we had about 28%, about a quarter of our population of students report that they knew what the learning target was in their class, they knew what that standard was, that they've received feedback specific to that standard, and then they can do something with it. They were able to customize or plan out their instruction because of the specific and timely feedback that they've received from the teacher. This 28% is a combination of, yes, I've gotten that feedback, and then the 3 is the highest level, is that added piece. I've taken some action and planned out my future learning because of that. A year ago, that 3%, or excuse me, of that 28%, only 9 were at that highest level. Only 9 students, or excuse me, 9% of the 1,200 students we interviewed said that they have gotten the feedback and then they know how to put into action some kind of learning plan. So then we had the same exact questions, and we did that this year. And we saw that over 80% of our students, so we jumped from about a quarter to over 80% reported that they know what their learning standards are and that they're giving that specific feedback. And then most importantly, that 9% is now up to 41%. It's not where we want it to be, but that's a huge growth in a year based on the professional development that we've provided, based on the focus on those standards, based on the focus on conferencing and reporting to kids. So these are students across all grade levels here in Kaneland that are taking the feedback directly, or excuse me, specifically to a standard, and then they are putting actions in place to improve their learning based on that standard. So we've had some internal conversations of what could be some other data points moving forward, but this is one that we've used as a district-wide school improvement goal over the last couple of years, and this was at our fingertips the most concrete example that we showed that this is effective for our students. When we can specifically teach the standards and provide feedback to that, it's having a huge impact on our kids. Lots of resources on there. Again, my plan is to email this out because a lot of these are live links for parents, students, for all of our stakeholders to access. So there's some important things on there.
Where will families be able to access that?
I'm going to email it out probably through School Messenger this presentation, and they would be able to get those links in there.
In there, okay.
Yep. And again, I know it'll be posted on our website, but if there are some of those specifics, because they're going to come up, that families, parents, students, I've had some students that have reached out and had a chance to sit down and talk with them. They can give me a call or an email. One thing that we did not share yet, and I'm going to speak for Mrs. Oslauger because she shared it with me earlier, we've had some students that are freshmen in college now that have reached out to some of our teachers and asked if they could come back and share with the current senior class how well prepared they are for college based on some of these practices that they took advantage of in their English class specifically last year. Students at a university where their thinking, their processing, their executive functioning planning, all of those because of their experience here last year in a small dose, how that really, really prepared them for college. So I think that's a huge celebration, and hopefully some more and more of those examples come through, but we do have kids that did experience in small doses last year that are living it this year at a university level that are doing very well.
Question.
Yes.
Earlier we talked about GPA.
Yes.
And we provide that GPA at the end of every year?
At each semester.
At each semester?
Each semester.
So those competitors, if you will, if they choose to share the GPAs, will be able to compete in that regards?
Yes, that will remain unchanged.
Okay.
GPA and transcript will remain unchanged.
And then hence, at the end of the 4 years, there will be an ultimate GPA for those individuals, for all individuals.
Correct, just like there is now, yes.
Hence, you'll have a class ranking. Hence, you'll have a valedictorian, salutatorian, right?
Yes.
Rank will remain unchanged.
What?
Yes, we will.
Everyone will still be ranked.
Oh, okay.
How do you handle weighted classes?
Same that we do now.
So you'll convert and then wait? Okay. I didn't know if the waiting happened earlier.
No.
It's the same.
Because math.
Are you having challenges figuring out what reported standard goes in what semester, or is that straightforward for obviously year-long classes?
That kind of depends on depends on the course and the structure of the course. And then as the department as a whole, or that course as a whole, that KLC, regarding how they work through that process. So in some cases, for a full year, you might have one or two standards that repeat. So you might have a couple that are in one versus the other. But right now, quite a few of our staff do believe that idea of repeating, that circling back and reusing and kind of doing that. So, and with math, it's a building, so it has to kind of work its way through there. So it's kind of a back and forth piece, but ultimately, the idea of covering all the standards, however they work it, is what they get in, whether it's a year or a semester.
I've heard angst of students if they don't feel prepared for a standard and they're assessed at it, the semester grade that's on their transcript, even if it can change. Maybe
Yep.
they move, it's still their grade, maybe they apply to college at a semester break, so is there a feeling that you've at least should have mastered it, even if you circle back, if you're going to
So-
be assessed on it?
Yeah, so some of that conversation is in regards to, especially when we're dealing with seniors and talking about that scholarship piece of when you're saying at that semester.
Yes, the semester
Right, yeah,
matters.
exactly.
There's
When-
angst over the semester.
Yes, exactly. And so looking at how that cycles through, and so yes, sort of saying, and possibly restructuring, saying, okay, at the semester, because we are in a semester system, and our computer system, that's it, we're kind of quote unquote done. We do need to look at that piece of sort of ending. But at the same time, what does it look like at the end of first semester? And then what does it look like at the end of second semester? And those definitions could change because you're mastering, you've actually worked, or you've gotten more practice here, and you're still kind of midway here.
And in my mind, I see that similar to the way elementary is, where they don't have everything at a master level always at a trimester now, I presume.
There's unintended consequences of that too, because I've heard stories of people, well, my grade point's too low and now I get to pay more for car insurance because of
I forgot about car insurance, but I thought about that as well before senior year, yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, here's what's interesting for Kaneland High School as well. It's always been the case that kids teachers have always been able to adjust students' grades, whether it was standards or traditional, from first semester into second. So if they had an issue, let's say first semester they struggled or something wrong, and a teacher wanted the opportunity for them to reassess.
But that's if they struggle or do something wrong. If it's built into the inherent structure of the class, I'm a little bit more concerned.
And there, honestly, yeah, and there's a piece of it already because the current system does that.
That's some of those logistics that we were talking about before of having that actual student evidence in front of you and vetting it with the proficiency table, that until we had it, we didn't know all of the intricacies of those pieces.
Yeah, and I don't, not to get into the details, I think there should be a true semester grade that is perceived as fair, not a year-long grade. Because I think the perception of year-long grades is a pretty tough, you don't really know where you stand until the end of the year, is a pretty tough thing, especially for them, the younger students, freshmen, sophomores.
And therein lies that piece of bigger philosophy on that long-term process of learning over the course of the year versus the structure that we're in, semester. And so working within both of those pieces.
Is there any discussion, whether from experts or just among yourselves, that under standards-based grading, weighting of classes really doesn't make any sense?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I can't believe I'm saying that, but.
Yes.
But if you're meeting standards, you're meeting standards. And, I mean,
Correct.
maybe you could put on the transcript, these are the accelerated level classes this student took and just list them because colleges, and then they could see it and they could, admissions counselors can do that in their
Right.
head.
And a lot
So
of
they
times,
can-
most colleges de-weight, a weighted grade to actually, that's why you have both a de-weight so that they can look at a comparable piece over the course of the group. And so yes, it has been a conversation, we're not
Because
there yet.
I can't imagine, you met the standard at this level and then we're just gonna bump it up.
Right.
I mean, it made sense I think in the old way, it made more sense, I don't know.
Right.
I think what you're describing almost changes the standard then. If we're bumping it up in place, sometimes it can get into, if you're talking about application, when you get into those details, sometimes it can change inherently what your expectations are, what that standard is meant to assess.
Because I would think in those classes, the standards are harder to achieve.
When you think
Maybe that's where it's, I don't.
Right. And our weighted courses as AP courses are that College Board level, which comes in and what has happened is in the process of Common Core and all those pieces, it actually has brought out standards that are more College Board level, not to say for them, but it's actually raising the bar each time those round of standards come out. And so you're starting to see some of that gap closing. It is still more challenging, it is still level college curriculum, et cetera, but it is kind of seen with Common Core and NGSS and all that, raising that bar to meet where it has that piece.
How are you measuring if this whole thing's successful or not? I mean, you've been piloting it for 3 years, and the goal is to better educate kids. How are you measuring that we're actually doing that by using this?
I would say it's probably that qualitative data that we've gotten back just from our seniors, because that's been the group that has been piloting the longest in regards to their preparation once they got to college, and those kids that come back and say something. We could look at grades and things like that. There's a piece of it.
Would that be more subjective? I mean, what you told me is pretty subjective.
It
but
is.
I'm looking for something concrete.
Right, I think the challenge of that then lies in those pieces of what are we looking for? Are we meeting those standards per se? And that's a piece that's gotten tightened up in the past year and a half in those pieces.
I think too, remember, there's often times where there is an assessment that used to be given that we're giving still now. We're just aligning it more to the standards. And so we can see the feedback is more on the standards, but the assessment is the same. So we can see how are they doing on the same assessment that they would have taken a couple of years ago, or portions of that same assessment too.
So you're saying grades are going up, so this is working? Is that the simple?
No, not
Okay,
necessarily.
then-
We said they would be staying the same, that we're not, that the students or the feedback is going to be more specific to those standards. So we can see when they were deficient or excelling, what area was it? But we can also compare the assessment that they took now compared to the past to make sure that it's.
You lost me.
Because you could have like
Okay, go
grades,
ahead.
the grades could go down.
Right.
Because the homework and things like that have been taken out. So there are students who are, their letter grade and their GPA will drop. Because
Okay.
they weren't really learning the standards before. So you can't use the old method to
So I guess.
compare to the new. You have to use the standards against standards, which you weren't measuring before, so you know.
So how do we know if this is worth all the effort you guys are going through?
I think in the immediate piece is some of the, that last graph I showed you, things we're doing year to year in-house here. What we will eventually start to see is some of the ACT, SAT scores, some of the standardized test scores of kids that are through the system. We're 7 months into it at the high school.
You're 3 years into it at the high school in
Not
some
fully,
courses.
not fully.
All right, 2.5.
So eventually, we'll start to see some of that triculate into standardized testing. That's some of your quantitative piece. Systematically, I think what we do with our school improvement goals are quantifiable pieces year in, year out with our students.
All right, so correct me where I'm wrong here.
Yep.
You're 2.5 years into a program that you want to go from a trial to across the building. And I'm asking you, how are you telling me that this is a good idea and it's working and we should go from the trial to the full building? And you're telling me you'll tell me later once you get more data?
I'm saying there's additional data points that will come. That slide, the previous slide from our school improvement plan, this piece is quantifiably, our students know, and the numbers show, they know what their standards are. They're receiving direct feedback on that and then taking action on that. I can't associate this to a letter grade, but the learning that is happening has increased from 2019 in February to this February in 2020 by a large number. We jumped from a quarter to over 80%. Those are the immediate quantifiable pieces that, because this is standards-based grading, the philosophy, the theory that we're going to give you a standard, teach that, provide you clear feedback on that. Students are receiving that, and that piece is starting to take shape. The quantifiable piece of how many, are there more A's now than there were last year?
No, I don't care about A's. I care whether or not the kids are learning better because you're doing this. And I still don't get, maybe I'm just dense today, but I still don't get how you're demonstrating the kids are learning better because of this.
Quantitatively, you would be comparing apples to oranges. You can't. You're going to have to go qualitative in just what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like you're reinventing the way that we do school, right? Like, so that's the problem. Like the premise is that we used to do school correctly, but really what we used to do was be good at school, not necessarily be good at learning, right? Now we're going to learning, but we might actually find out that students are better at being at school than they are at learning, but we don't care about being good at school, we care about being good at learning, right? So we might find out that like there's all kinds of stuff we have to unpack from that.
Mhm.
Is that a?
Great summary,
Okay.
fabulous, thank you.
Great
Much
point,
better than we
Pat.
did. Thank you.
So is there a feeling that, okay, so, you know, we've always enjoyed lots of students with upper level GPAs in the high school, and yet we have not enjoyed high standardized assessment grades. Is there a feeling that this is it? Because for me, I feel like finally, I know what the gap is, I know what it is. You know, it was a lot of extraneous stuff adding to that percentage. And I mean, I'm extremely hopeful that this is the answer. This is what's gonna do it. And I've been on the board for 11 years. So, I mean, I'm really excited, but I'm just, you know, am I off track? Do you guys feel that?
Yep,
I
and
mean,
I
you
could.
must, because you wouldn't be doing it
Yep,
otherwise.
and give anecdotal examples of that, of going back. I was in classrooms in the elementary level, and I promise you that their letter grade, whatever that was not, it declined a little bit. But the learning was exponentially better than what it had been in the years past, because I could sit down with a third grader and they could open up a continuum book and say, I'm here. Here is what I need to do to go on to the next level. And I'm going to do that by watching 2 videos on Khan Academy, then conferencing with Mr. Rowley, and then I'm going to take this assessment for my summative to show that I proved it. Then they mark. The way that kids talk, not just teachers, but the way that kids talk about their learning is completely different than it was when I was here 6 years ago. And that's with a third grader, a second grader, and those kids are then going through the systems. At the middle school and high school, those conversations are having, again, and that's anecdotal. Kids, there's still a frustration piece. There's still, we're making people uncomfortable with those shifts in the changes in how we are doing school, in the expectation that we have, and that we're refocusing that on the learning piece. Is it worthwhile? Yes. I've seen quantifiably in other districts that have been doing this for 10 or 15 years, and I'd be happy to share it, but it is a standardized test that they give for the PISA test. It's an international test. In this district that's been doing it for about 10 or 12 years now, scores higher than every country in the world minus Japan and South Korea. And in some cases, they are scoring higher than those. So that quantifiable piece on how they do on the OECD test, that piece is a bit of a data piece. Again, it's not necessarily comparing their population to ours, but they've been doing this system and they've seen that growth on international standardized tests. So that excites me to start to see that here, in how, even though it is challenging, even though teachers and professional learning communities are pushing each other's thinking, it's really great conversations, and it's really causing teachers to relook at how they teach. It's causing teachers to throw away what I've done in my file cabinet for the last 10 years and rewrite an assessment to truly assess a student on where they're at. So that's just me personally, but I feel like even though it's hard, even though it's been a challenge and a struggle, absolutely on the right track.
And I think from a high school perspective example that I can share, and I shared when I was here at the board last year as well, every April and May, one of the honors I have as Assistant Principal of Student Services is to meet with our most at-risk seniors that we are trying to get to that minimum graduation standard. And at the middle of April last year, I met with the 30 most at-risk seniors. And the difference in our most at-risk seniors talking about, I need to do this worksheet and gain this many points versus here's what I don't know in this class that I need to reassess on, was quite frankly shocking to me. I got done with those meetings and I came back and I said, you guys are not going to believe what our kids are talking about. And when we take that and connect back to the mission statement of graduating all of our students college, career, and community ready, and we really talk about what's the thing that we want for all of our students. We want all of them to wherever they are going to go, whatever that next opportunity is for them, to know what they don't know, and to be able to advocate for what they need, whether that's in a job setting or in a career setting, a college setting, a community setting. That's what this learning and this standards-based learning and grading is really, really reinforcing and teaching them to do.
I'm gonna circle back, because I don't think I got an answer that I was looking for, not that I was looking for, I don't think I got an answer. And Joe, I'm gonna direct it right at you, because in my eyes, you are the head of the high school. Again, back to the question, GPA, valedictorian, salutatorian, are we keeping it? Yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Last comment on this altogether. I mean, I see some, if I look at the outside world, and being in the outside world as I was working body, if you will, some of these things like the motivation, having not being able, don't have to do the homework type of thing, and yeah, you assess them a different way, I get it. Quizzes also, apparently you don't have to take quizzes, at least what I'm hearing, or if you do,
Yep, I think
they're
that-
not part of the ultimate test itself?
Yep. They're not part of the final summative grade, but they are given, they're assessed. The most simplified way of putting that is homework quizzes, worksheets, even though we've moved away from that, is that I can enter even a score of a 1, 2, 3, or 4, and it's just weighted as a 0%. So it's not converting that to a letter grade, but on a day-to-day basis, I can look on Canvas and see that on most of these assignments, I'm at a 3 or 4, even though it's not weighted, even though it's not, but as we talk about that GPS journey, I know that I'm trending in the direction of an A or a B because most of my day-to-day assignments are 3s and 4s, or I'm really struggling and most of my day-to-day stuff is a 1. Oh, I've never done my homework for 2 weeks. I need to sit down with the teacher and have a conversation on how to change that. So you are correct in that it doesn't impact the final grade, but students are still assigned homework. The expectation is that they are doing those pieces.
And I kind of, like a lot of people will talk about practice, so like for sports analogies, what a lot of people use for standards-based grading is that you've got to go to practice, you got to put the work in, even though you could, practice your heart out. You go to the game, that's where it truly counts. Like that's where you show your stuff. That's where you show that you've done the practice, you spent the time in the gym, you've done all those things. And that summative would be the game analogy. So there is a link in there about how football can describe, and explain standards-based grading on the back there if you want more details. But that's kind of a different analogy to look at that piece too, because it's still there.
And it's a shift in mindset, but if we never went to standards-based grading, there's still going to be a lot of kids that aren't doing their homework or that are, what's unique with standards-based grading and layered in with personalized learning is that we can start to really tailor engaging instruction to individual needs, and that's where some of that motivation will come in of a football lesson for math, or using fantasy football to teach fractions, or there's things like that where we can reach kids through that personalized layer that comes into standards-based grading that may not necessarily have been there in the past.
So what are you hearing from the parents?
Honestly, it's all over the board. Some that I think the biggest, the one that hit home the most was I talked with a parent in probably October, November, and it was, man, my kids hate this. And then followed up a couple months later, and it's, okay, it's starting to make sense, and they can explain their standards, kind of what Ms. Amiris was saying. They understand it now, and they can come home and have those conversations. So while it was new and while it was a change, there was a lot of frustrations. But as kids implement that more and more, it is starting to make sense to them. But some that say, thank you, this is the greatest thing that we've ever done. Some that said, I can't wait till this goes away and you change your mind, and kind of everywhere in between. If we didn't have the extent of the resources that we have available to us, if we didn't have other districts that have gone through this journey and we see what they're doing now to back up that piece, maybe we'd be swayed closer to, do we need to have a conversation about not being standards-based? But there's so many pieces that point that this is going in the right direction, where we have to take a deep breath and take a step back and say we're young into this journey.
Are all of the schools around us doing standard-based?
Not all. Yorkville is. We've conferenced extensively with Belvedere, which is a little bit further up north. Some are not. Some are a mixed hybrid where their elementaries are, or their elementary middle, and their high school is in the process of Batavia standard space.
U46 rolled out standard space a couple years ago.
So not everybody, but definitely a topic of conversation, and some are beginning that
And you're
transition.
getting good reviews from those that are doing it? Or have some of them left it and gone back?
A lot of people have experienced the frustrations of changing that mindset. Haven't had a conversation with anybody that wants to go back to the way traditional grades have been.
Okay.
It's more of the working through the frustration and helping educate people to understand, especially parents, and trying to help their kids, because
Well,
it's a
because
different.
they didn't go through it.
It's a different conversation, right?
Yeah.
And so we've gotten a lot of resources on how to be able to do that, and we want to keep implementing and starting with you guys and continuing to put that out there.
So, not everybody drinks the water, right?
Correct.
Sorry,
Is
what,
that the-
Pedro?
Not everybody drinks the water.
Okay.
So is that 40% that you're saying that we gotta obviously bring up? Is just trying to understand it. And then also, I wanted to get back with the 30 seniors that you had to motivate, I guess, to be able to graduate. And obviously, they probably didn't drink the water along the way. So therefore, and that's reality though.
Mhm.
Not everybody's going to be able to be there.
Yep.
Although we wish.
Correct.
So given that, how do we, I guess, continue to motivate these students when they don't have to turn in homework, when they don't have to do this? Because you do that in the working world, you're thrown out.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You only 1, 2, 3, you're out.
Yep, and yes, I understand that. We have not gotten rid of that expectation, that they don't have to turn it in, that it's
That's
not
not what I'm hearing from the
important.
students.
It is historically, that's been the case at any given time of kids being motivated to turn in work. Because of this transition to standards-based, it hasn't turned, from my experience, turned kids off to, now I have a free pass not to do anything. I can sit back, and then a week before semester I can take the test and I can pass it. There are certainly some that may have gone that route, but for the most part, students are motivated to learn. We haven't had a drastic decrease in kids attending in class, disruptions in class because of standards-based grading. As far as the drinking the water piece, a lot of it is to those students that felt unmotivated, and again, this is particular to me of what my experience has been, of sitting down with those parents and really drilling into what the specific issues are, where a lot of frustrations, a lot of difficulties with change, standards-based grading has kind of become the scapegoat for that. Because you've made this transition to standards-based grading, now all of these things are happening. But when I can have a one-to-one connection with somebody and start to process through that, then we start to see, well, it's not necessarily standards-based grading, it's I'm now in a higher level math, or maybe wasn't. Course selection couldn't have been what was most, so it really becomes individualized to the student, where a lot of the angst at first is wrapped up in standards-based grading. And then when we reach out and start to have those one-on-one conversations, it's, well, I'm never communicated with. Well, here are several places where you can find those communications. So when we break it down by student, a lot of times, not to say that appeases everyone, but a lot of times there's a sigh of relief, and at least a plan moving forward on how to get over some of those motivational speed bumps.
Pedro, I think there were ways to game the system before. There will be ways to game the system now. It's just which game you're playing. It doesn't
Well,
matter
I
if you're
guess what
doing
I was-
traditional or standards-based. Because I've been told that I can take the assessment as many times as I want, so why bother learn anything? Take the assessment and then figure out what I need to know. So I think your point is going to be, it doesn't matter which way they're doing the grading. There's still going to be kids that are trying to figure out the loopholes.
True, and that's reality. That's reality. I guess I just wanted to hear how we're motivating these guys, and uniquely, obviously graduating,
Well,
obviously, right?
that's where the student services department really comes in. That's where RTI and our multi-tiered systems of support really come in. That's where all of the fabulous teachers that we have that have those great connections with our students come in. There was none of those students that was the first time we had ever heard their names. Like, there had been reasons why they were in that group of at-risk students. And if we had been in a traditional grading system, it still would have been the
Yes,
same.
I agree.
Yep,
I agree.
and it's about giving them the opportunity to prove what they have learned.
And I feel like best practices are still being developed, like if you don't turn in the rough draft, you can't reassess the final.
Absolutely.
Because for a while, you just didn't have to turn in the rough draft and you could reassess the final. But, so I feel like maybe there's some more bumpers being put up, and I think those are important.
Sure, we're learning along the way.
Yeah.
I think too, if you look at a student in Kaneland from kindergarten through 12th grade, you don't hear the conversation about, am I turning in my work in elementary school? They're just doing it, right? And that's just they're not getting points for it, it's not showing up on the report card some way, they're doing it. So how do we keep that mentality of that, their metacognition too, how do we keep that going in through middle school and high school, and that be what our conversation is about more so than that changing it to a point system. Pedro, let me just kind of circle back to your question just one more time. Our current course book says we have valedictorians, salutatorians, we have weighted grades, we have all of class rank, all of those things, right? As Teresa was alluding to, where these conversations will go and decisions that we have to make down the road, I can't predict right now, but I do challenge us.
I figured that was coming, that's why
I do
wanted
challenge
hold
us
you
to, yeah.
to it.
Right now, that's where we're at.
Specifically, I asked you.
But that's where we're at right now, but I do challenge us to think about what is the purpose of all of those things, and do we still need that purpose and in that way? And we might find that, yes, that is still what we want to do, and we might find that we need to make some changes.
The reality of life is competition exists. And I don't want to say water the system, because we're trying to teach these kids. I agree with that.
Yeah.
But the reality is competition exists. When I see my son being hired by NASA, 1,500 students, only hired 2. The competition was there big time. And I feel like we're watering it down to a certain degree.
Yeah. And I would argue that with the standards base, we're actually making it a little bit more robust. The conversation's a little bit deeper, a lot deeper than what it would have been before. But I agree, competition does motivate many kids, and how do we continue to do that, I think, will be a great discussion. Yeah.
And then you have it obviously in all our sports.
So on another topic, it would be tragic if all of this hard work and everything ran up against a resources issue and, where, so I'm sure you're going to be bringing us I guess I would say don't hold back, like at least let us know, because we know, Dr. Fuchs can tell us, well, this is how much money we have, and you can say, well, this is what we need, and, we just want to make sure that we support it to the best of our ability. I'm not saying we're just going to spend, that's not what I mean, but I just, but, as far as giving it the proper proportion of resources, I think is important.
Are we good for this evening?
I agree with that. I really agree with that.
All right, thank you very much.
so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Can I make one more comment? So,
Nope, you missed it.
So obviously, there's no recommendation here.
Right.
So obviously, we're rolling with this.
Yes.
Hence, his question is, where do we decide we're going? And we're not coming back. Or is it already made?
We are there. We are moving to standards-based grading K-12.
All right, cool.
Just the one part is still unknown as far as parts of when it's going to be fully implemented.
Yeah, the timeline.
Right, the timeline.
All right.
Which,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Superintendent report.
Yes, a couple topics. First of all, the Kaneland Foundation met last week, and for the couple times, previous meetings, we were talking about possible rebranding opportunity, looking at what we can do to maybe move forward and adjust and shift our practices. I'm excited to share that Kaneland Foundation has voted to approve an engagement activity with the Marquette Hamlin Group, which is based in Sugar Grove, to bring in an outside consultant to look at our bylaws, look at our officers, look at our practices, and maybe reshift, readjust, and refocus the way the foundation operates. Because I think what the foundation does is a great service for the district to provide grants for teachers to directly impact students. But our work of raising funds has been stagnant, and it's been good work, but the amount has been stagnant. So with this activity, with this engagement, over the next couple months, we will look at marketing, we will look at rebranding, our policies, our procedures, the board itself, how the board operates. So it'll be a good chance to completely relook at everything that the foundation does to eventually grow and become more vibrant and bring in more dollars for the foundation. Anything, Shauna is our board member, President Sparber is our board member rep. Is there anything you want to
You got it.
add? Okay, we'll keep you updated on that. Kaneland Connects, which is our next strategic plan, that committee meets Wednesday, March 18th, so a little over a week. And that is our third of 3 meetings, so we will wrap that up. The actual strategic plan won't be done that night. We will have the vast foundation done, we'll have the template done, and we will continue to work on it, and we'll bring that to the board for final approval as we get done, probably moving into the summer. Next, speaking of moving into the summer and spring break, the coronavirus, COVID-19, as you've seen here, there's quite a bit of news on it, and it is changing rapidly. So one of the things we've been doing, as you know, we sent out the original letter, we've updated the website, and rather than send out a letter every time there's new news, because there's new news almost hourly, if not daily, we are putting the information on the website for people to go to the website and access that. We do have a meeting with the countywide nurses on Friday. We're looking to get the superintendents back together again because the news that came out late this afternoon from the ISBE, they are going to, if you recall, e-learning. With the law passed, there was a series of 4 or 5 steps that were required to be able to utilize e-learning. Those steps most likely are going to be relaxed by the state board, so that way if there is, and again, this is not an announcement of anything being shut down anywhere across the district or the county, but if we do get to that point, how long would we be out and what our options would be. So we will continue to look at that and work on that and make sure that we have that plan in place if we do get to that point.
Are you thinking those relaxed rules would just be for this time period? They're
Yes.
not looking to change it?
No,
But just
no. It would just be
an
now, it
option
would be
for
as far as the
districts.
public
Okay.
hearing, as far as communicating with associations, though, that type of work that is expected now, it'd be probably just through the remainder of this year, and then they would assess it going on.
Who knows, it might be positive,
That's right.
right? Then
Yeah,
it makes
they
it a
went
little
well.
easier,
It
a little
may-
easier
it may
to
force
accept it.
districts to look at that, and then there will be the conversation from the ISBE too about which days you might have to make up if districts aren't ready to do that or don't do that and take the time off. Will days need to be made up? How many days? What do we have to do that? And still, that said, we are still using the guidance from the Illinois Department of Public Health and the CDC for we can't quarantine a student, we can't quarantine a family. We have that information to go to the Illinois Department of Public Health, and they make those decisions. They're the experts. And then the State Board of Education will then dictate the Illinois policy or the district policies that we follow. So
That
we are.
sounds like a lot of barriers. How do you get there quick?
Well,
It's the state of Illinois. We don't. We don't.
We'll be too late.
Yeah, what we're gonna do is have the plan, we're gonna finalize it over the next couple days, finalize that, then be ready to communicate it if and when those situations arise. So we don't, it's a
would
game
be-
of hurry up and wait to some extent, but a plan still needs to be developed.
so if for some reason we needed to, it'd be the administration saying we're closing the school for whatever, or is it gonna be the state board that's gonna dictate to us?
Depending on, if it becomes
statewide is a mass emergency, then they could dictate the whole state. What generally would happen right now, as you see different companies closing, different buildings, airlines, those kind of things, what would happen would be probably district by district and or building by building as cases are apparent or new information is learned from the Department of Public Health. They would probably start by buildings and or districts. And we may never even get to that point, but we're planning and preparing in case we do. And then the last point, hopefully, March 3rd through April 2nd is spring break. There's some fear and optimism over spring break at the same time. There's the optimism that everybody will go away for a week and we can clean the buildings again intensely for a full week without knobs and door handles and things being touched. But then also again, there's the fear that people are going away and what might they bringing back to them to reintroduce to our schools. So, we will follow the news, we will follow the Illinois Department of Public Health and the state board and communicate accordingly and let you know as changes are made or any recommendations are needed. Yes.
I saw the update that the overseas trip is canceled. I know a lot of the sports teams travel during spring break. Is there at a drop dead date where you're going to decide whether or not they're going so people can plan accordingly? I mean, you're not going to announce the Friday before the bus leaves Saturday morning that the trip's canceled. I'm assuming there's...
Yeah, no, we're just like we did assess the spring break trip. Leading up to that, we'll do the same thing with these trips. We're communicating with the other states, communicating with the other schools that are in place, checking with the CDC, and the state board, again, has some governance over what we do in the IHSA, but we can determine our field trips. But if at some point the state board says do not travel, or if the CDC says it's not wise to leave to go to different states, we would follow that. But anything short of that guidance, we would just use our own common sense to determine how far we would want to go and who we're going to send.
Okay.
Yep. And the sooner we know, the better.
Yes.
And so that does bring up the point that we do have the spring break travel abroad trip that was going to Greece and Spain. We did have communication. Mrs. Jersenko was wonderful with the foresight that she had trying to communicate, and we did decide to move forward, canceling that trip earlier this afternoon. She will communicate with the families, and there are voucher opportunities, and while it's a drawback, it is the right move to not have our students go somewhere where we can't guarantee exactly what's going to take place while they're there, or they're transitioned back with other changes that may take place.
Are there other planned trips? I know like baseball team usually goes to Hilton Head or whatever. Is there any other teams that are?
I believe there are 2 spring sports trips that are planned to travel out of state. And again, that goes back to Mr. Carey's question of monitoring those, where they're going, the school districts they're traveling to, where they're going to stay. Those types of things we'll monitor. And use the same judgment and assessment to determine if they should go or not.
Okay.
Thank you. I know Dr. Fuchs has 1 or 2.
If I have 2. The master planning facilities for the high school is meeting on Wednesday night. So Ryan and Pedro, that's both of you, 7 o'clock in the district office.
I will not be there. I'll be in DC.
Okay, thank you. Pedro.
Barring unforeseen circumstances, I'll be there.
Okay, thank you. All right. Secondly, I did lock in the fuel price, I believe it was last week, at $2 diesel for $2.14. That's about 21 cents less than what we're paying this year. At 120,000 gallons, it should be around a $25,000 savings, depending on how much actual is used throughout the upcoming year. So, that's good.
Good. All right, any topics for future agendas? No? See, now we have public comment. Are you here for public? I'm going to read a spiel while you're walking. The board values public input to inform our decision-making and to provide information and insight into what is happening throughout the district. Board meetings are held to conduct the business of the Board of Education and are required by law to take place in public. However, they are not public forums. We use the public comment section as an opportunity to listen to our stakeholders. For that reason, the board does not enter into debate or respond to questions spontaneously or without proper investigation and deliberation. In most cases, concerns or questions requiring follow-up will be referred to the superintendent. If you choose to speak publicly, we ask that you do so at the microphone, state your name and your village residence or your association with us for the record, and limit your comments to 3 minutes or less so that all who wish to speak may have that opportunity. Public comment is a maximum of 30 minutes with a 20-minute total length of time for any one subject. You're encouraged to seek a private appointment to discuss matters concerning the individual students or staff members. While public education can be an emotional issue, and understandably so, the board strives to maintain a certain level of decorum at the meeting. Those who speak are expected to maintain a tone of courtesy and civility. There you go. Thank you. Thank you.
59 seconds, that's awesome.
And I apologize for keeping you later. I will try to keep it at that 3-minute. My name is Kim Bartkowiak, and I am a parent in Kaneland and live in Elburn. I have 3 students, 2 middle school and 1 at the high school. I may go a couple seconds over. I do want to say I'm here to talk about the standard-based grading. I've conversed with many people. My 3 students do have fantastic teachers who at the beginning have given them as much as they can, the information. They know what's going on, but it doesn't make the frustration any less. And that's why I continue to discuss, continue to research, and continue to bring things to your attention. I do appreciate the attempting of having an outline for a unified structure. I know that was something that we had talked about, that I've talked about with many of you before. However, it's a little disappointing that I feel that there are still some key areas that have been overlooked from discussion. And one of them being the formative assessments. And we go back to them still not having any bearing on grades. Not allowing the cumulative work of a student that the student puts forth assesses them on a very, very small scale, a small amount of work that cannot possibly measure their true intelligence. There are quarters where my child has 2 grades that they are assessed on, and that is what their whole entire quarter is based off of. That is an all or nothing type of grade. That did not put in the hours of work, the quizzes that they took, redoing things, studying at home. Would you like me to assess, not to call out our summer school principal, but on her 1 letter that she sent out and didn't spell her name correctly in the signature? Would you like that to be my interpretation of her? Or should I look at all of her past work and her education, her experience, and her contributions? I would think the latter. You would want all of that information to attribute to my final assessment of her. I also still feel that the respect for parents' information, being actual, factual, how we're implementing, and the resources of how other areas have implemented it is still laxed. I do not need cute video cartoons and theory-based why it's so great. I wonder who you're trying to convince, myself or yourself, when I get these. I look at many of the resources that we are given in the newsletters, many of the ones I retyped from looking at the resources tonight. I've looked at over a dozen of them, and they're all still theory-based and why it's great, but I haven't seen implementation and how it actually looks in the school, and that's still very disappointing. Finally, a conversation about what it means in terms of that final destination. You talk about GPS and having a journey, but in the end, we have to get somewhere. The final destination has to be there. Our kids are going to have a grade at some point. Looking at what you've laid out, and I know it's just a very preliminary, but one of the discussions I had with a few of you before about this is, yes, it's great to be uniform, but we also have to really look at what it means. There are actually over 8 different ways, when you look at the research, that standard-based grading can be finally assessed. And it's subjective how you do it. Some do how many 4s and 3s and 2s and 1s. Some do a percentage. Some do a mean. Some do a median. I can go on. Those are just a few that I've got down. I think some of this might answer some of your questions. I can write it on the board. I have actually assessed what it would mean for Kaneland to have an A. And that one doesn't work. And again, I know that this is not set in stone, but let's just have a little visual idea of what it means. So an A, if you have 15 standards, the top that is on right from the slideshow, that gives you, it has to be no 1s or 2s. Let's give you all 14 4s. Let's give you one at the highest a 3. Our mean, that some districts that we would be competing to with colleges, would be a 3.9. Our median is a 4. Our percent average is a 98.3 for an A. That looks pretty right. That looks pretty uniform. Our B, on those 15 standards, I also want to add that's 59 out of 60. Our B is a 50 out of 60. At least 11 4s. No more than 3 1s. So let's do 3 1s. And let's say there's, what's left over is the highest is a 3. The mean is a 3.3. Your median is a 4. Your percent is an 83%. This is where it gets important.
You need to wrap up. Thank you.
This is where it gets important, and I know I need to wrap up. Your C student is 54 out of 60. No, at least 9 4s. Let's give all the rest 3s. That's a mean of a 3.6, a median of a 4, and a percent of a 90%. So what I would like to know is, how do I explain to my student, hoping to get a scholarship, that they have a C, and other schools where they have the same standard base, but do percentage, has an A on their report card and will get the scholarship? How do I tell my anxious child who is doing their best and struggling, but manages to get all 4s and 3s, sees her friend who gets a 1, and she has a C and they have a B in the end? Because the truth is, no, they're not saying what extra credit, what homework do I need in order to get that A. They're saying, well, what do I need to get a 4? They're just using a different word. So this is what I'm saying is the subjectivity to it, where we lose the competition that is fact in life. The fact that homework might bump things, the responsibility to get them life ready, whether it's career, college, or whatever. That the subjectivity, we lose our ability to be competitive with other schools.
Okay, thank you.
My last note.
I'm sorry, I have to be fair, and this is how we run the meetings. It's been over 3 minutes.
I just want to offer, I'll leave this.
Thank you.
If you want to have the
Thank
math.
you.
Thank you very much. I
Thank you.
apologize for going over.
All right. So closed session, we do have closed session tonight. The Board of Education is scheduled for a closed session where we anticipate action to be taken following the closed session. Once the closed session has been concluded, the recording will include the action taken by the Board of Education planned for this evening. Let me flip. We're going into closed session for Illinois Code 122C1. Is there a motion to go into closed session for this reason?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
And a roll call.
Mr. Rivas.
Aye.
Mrs. Farber.
Aye.
Mrs. Witt.
Aye.
Mrs. Junk.
Aye.
Mr. Carey.
Aye.
Mr. Lawler.
Aye.
Mrs. Pavlik.
Aye.
Motion carries 7-0. We're in
7.
Okay, so we're now back in open session where the live video stream will continue. All right, we are here for a notice to remedy, whereas the Board of Education of Kaneland School District Number 302 has received reports from the district administration regarding the conduct and performance of Patrick Carter, a teacher in the district, whereas the board finds that and determines that such reports state causes, reasons, and defects in the conduct and performance of Patrick Carter, which if not removed are causes and reasons warranting the discharge and dismissal of Patrick Carter as a teacher in this district, whereas the board herewith finds and determines that the conduct and performance of Patrick Carter to date in this district have been unsatisfactory. Now therefore be it resolved by the Board of Education of Kaneland School District Number 302, Kane and DeKalb Counties, Illinois as follows, that the President and Secretary of the Board of Education are hereby authorized and directed to sign and serve or cause to be served on behalf of the Board of Education upon Patrick Carter a notice to remedy substantially in the form of Exhibit 1 attached to hereto and made a part hereof, which notice enumerates causes, reasons, and defects that the board determines, if not remedied, may result in the discharge and dismissal of Patrick Carter as a teacher in the school district. All right, so I'll make a motion that the Board of Education approves this notice to remedy for Patrick Carter. Is there a second?
Second.
And a roll call?
Sparber.
Aye.
Witt.
Aye.
Junk.
Aye.
Lawler.
Aye.
Carey.
Aye.
Pavick. Aye. And Rivas.
Aye.
Motion carries 7-0. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.